The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 1, Audiobook Listening Script. The Engineered Ecstasy, Reconstructing Ancient Ritual Technologies of Consciousness by Fletcher. Part 2 of 2, Bwiti, Teonanácatl, Mechanisms and Synthesis. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 2, 2. Series Introduction. Welcome to the Historical Documents Access Project, an ongoing series created to make important historical documents and historical research more accessible to English-speaking listeners. This is part 2 of a two-part audiobook presentation of The Engineered Ecstasy, Reconstructing Ancient Ritual Technologies of Consciousness by Fletcher. Part 1 introduced ritual as cognitive technology and examined Chavin de Huantar, the Eleusinian Mysteries, the Vedic Soma Sacrifice, and the Mazatec Velada. Part 2 begins with Bwiti Iboga initiation. It continues through the Aztec sacred mushroom tradition documented in the Florentine Codex, a contemporary case study, the mechanisms that may underlie ritual effects, and the author's final synthesis. This recording is presented for education, preservation, and historical study. The views and claims in the text belong to the author. This presentation is not medical advice and should not be understood as encouragement to use controlled substances. You are listening to Part 2, the concluding installment of this title. Part 2, 6 Reconstructive Case Studies. 2.5, The Bwiti Iboga Initiation, Death and Return in the Gabonese Forest. Somewhere in the equatorial rainforest of Gabon, in the darkness of a temple hut called the Abanza, a young person lies on a mat while their community sits around them. They have been chewing pieces of the bark of the root of the plant called Tabernanthe Iboga for hours. The dose has been substantial. The nausea has passed. What is happening now is not what happens in a Mazatec Velada or at Eleusis. This is something else. The initiate is looking, and what they are seeing is not the ordinary world. They are traveling. They are meeting people they have never met in this life, but recognize on sight. They are encountering the ancestors. They are undergoing what the Bwiti tradition calls the death of the old self, and if the ceremony works as intended, they will return before dawn as someone else, reborn, restored to the path, initiated into the mysteries their community has been transmitting for at least 1,000 years. Bwiti is the spiritual discipline of several forest-dwelling peoples of Gabon and adjacent regions of Central Africa. Its earliest practitioners were the Babongo Pygmies, the ancient forest peoples of the Gabonese interior, who discovered the properties of Iboga and developed the initial ceremonial framework around its use. From the Babongo it was transmitted to the Mitsogo and the Apinji peoples of southern Gabon, who formalized what became the Disumba tradition. From there it spread, in the closing decades of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, to the Fang people of northern Gabon, who blended it with their own ceremonial practices and elements of the Catholic Christianity that had been recently introduced by French missionaries. Bwiti is now one of the 3 officially recognized religions of Gabon. It is practiced across a range of ethnic groups: Fang, Mitsogo, Punu, Apinji, Eshera, Koda. And it exists in a considerable variety of local forms, each with its own emphases, its own particular chants, and its own understanding of what the ceremonies are for. What holds all of these variants together is Iboga. The primary ethnographic source for the argument this chapter will make is James W. Fernandez's Bwiti, an ethnography of the religious imagination in Africa, published by Princeton University Press in 1982. Fernandez, an anthropologist trained at Northwestern who spent extended periods in Gabon between the late 1950s and the 1970s, wrote the definitive English-language study of the Fang Bwiti, and his work remains the essential reference for anyone approaching the tradition from outside. A parallel corpus of French-language work by Otto Goldhofer covers the older Mitsogo Bwiti, and more recent work by Julien Bonhomme has extended the ethnographic record to the Bwiti Misoko variant. I want to acknowledge, following the same principle I invoked in the Mazatec chapter, that Bwiti is a living tradition owned by specific Central African communities. Its Western circulation, particularly the emergence of Ibogaine-based addiction treatment centers outside Gabon, has raised the same ethical questions the Mazatec case raises about extraction, appropriation, and the obligations that respectful attention entails. What follows is an attempt at respectful attention, not a claim of ownership. The plant Iboga is Tabernanthe iboga, a small perennial rainforest shrub in the family Apocynaceae. It grows only in the Central African forest, primarily in Gabon and adjacent parts of Cameroon, the Republic of Congo, and Equatorial Guinea. The pharmacologically active parts of the plant are the roots, particularly the bark of the roots, which are dug up, prepared as chewed pieces or as a powder mixed with liquid, and consumed by the initiate over a period of several hours during the ceremony. The root bark contains at least 12 identified alkaloids, of which the primary psychoactive compound is ibogaine. Ibogaine is pharmacologically unlike any of the compounds we have considered in the earlier chapters of this book. It is not a classical serotonergic psychedelic in the family of psilocybin, mescaline, or LSD. It is a complex atypical psychoactive whose full mechanism of action is still being characterized in the modern pharmacological literature, but that appears to involve activity at NMDA receptors, opioid receptors, particularly kappa opioid, serotonergic systems, and dopaminergic systems, along with effects on neurotrophic factors that persist for weeks after a single dose. What this pharmacological profile produces in the actual experience of the participant is quite different from what the classical psychedelics produce. Ibogaine at a full initiatory dose produces long-lasting, coherent, dreamlike visions that are less abstract than a psilocybin experience and more narrative. Users describe watching a kind of movie of their own life, of their ancestors' lives, and of encounters with entities that the tradition identifies as the dead. The experience lasts substantially longer than a psilocybin or ayahuasca experience. A full initiatory session runs for approximately 36 hours from onset to full recovery, with the peak visionary phase occupying the central 12 to 24 hours. The compound is also notably harder on the body than the classical psychedelics. Nausea and vomiting are common. Muscular coordination is impaired for extended periods, and the cardiovascular effects require careful attention because ibogaine can prolong the QT interval and produce cardiac arrhythmias in vulnerable individuals. Traditional Bwiti practice screens candidates carefully and knows to abort a ceremony that is not going well. The Bwiti tradition understands Iboga not as a drug, but as a sacred plant. The name sacred wood, bois sacré in the French rendering that became standard through colonial ethnography, captures the tradition's own framing. The plant is a person, or the vehicle of a person. In Fang cosmology, Iboga was given to humanity by the first ancestor. In Mitsogo cosmology, it was revealed by forest spirits to those who could hear them. In both traditions, the plant carries an intentionality of its own, and the ceremony is not simply the ingestion of a chemical, but the invitation of the plant person into the ritual space to do work on the initiate. The structure of the initiation. The Bwiti initiation ceremony is called by various names in different traditions and languages. Fernandez glosses one version as returning to the path. The initiate has strayed from proper relationship with the ancestors, with the community, and with the true nature of things, and the ceremony returns them to alignment. The initiate is called a banzi. The ceremony leader is called the nganga or nima, terms that carry the connotation of expert, master, one who knows. Different Bwiti lineages have different specific terminology, but the underlying roles are consistent: a trained ritual specialist, a candidate for initiation, and a community of witnesses and supporting practitioners. The initiation takes place in the Ibanza, the temple hut, which is a specifically designed ceremonial space distinct from ordinary dwelling houses. The Fang Ibanza is a long rectangular structure with a specific ritual layout. A central pole running from floor to ceiling, altars at the ends of the space, hanging cloths and mirrors, and specific ritual objects arranged in specific positions. The central pole is often understood as the axis mundi, the connection between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. Mirrors are placed to reflect and multiply the initiate's image at specific points in the ceremony, invoking the encounter between the initiate and their own doubled self. The whole architectural arrangement of the Iboga is designed to structure the initiate's experience during the peak of the Iboga effect. The ceremony is preceded by a period of preparation that varies considerably across traditions, but generally includes days or weeks of dietary restriction, sexual abstinence, and specific ritual purifications. The candidate meets repeatedly with the Nganga to discuss what they hope to encounter, to be assessed for readiness, and to be prepared for what is coming. This is again the extended set and setting phase, occupying not hours, but days or weeks of the participant's life before the ceremony proper begins. The community around the candidate is also prepared. Family members, friends, and members of the Bwiti congregation who will be present for the ceremony are aware of what is happening and have been part of the process of building toward it. On the night of the initiation, the ceremony begins after dark. The initiate arrives at the Iboga dressed in ceremonial white or in specific ritual garments depending on the tradition. There is a fire talk, a period of instruction and orientation before the Iboga is administered, during which the Nganga speaks to the initiate about what they are about to undergo and what the tradition expects of them. Then the Iboga is administered. Because the effective dose is substantial, and because ibogaine takes several hours to reach full effect, the plant material is consumed in stages across the first several hours of the ceremony, with additional portions added as the Nganga judges appropriate. The initiate is not alone. Musicians play throughout, drummers and shakers, and most centrally, the mungongo harp, a musical bow of specific construction whose sound is inseparable from Bwiti ceremony in the Fang tradition. Chanting continues throughout the ceremony in a sacred ritual language sometimes called pope, which is close to mitsogo and carries the specifically ceremonial vocabulary of the tradition, and in the vernacular Fang or mitsogo of the participants. The onset of the Iboga is felt over the first hours. Nausea and vomiting are common during this phase and are expected. The tradition understands them as part of the physical purging that opens the way for the visionary work. Muscular control diminishes. The initiate lies down. The environment darkens except for the fire and the ritual lights. The music continues, and somewhere in the first 4 to 8 hours, the visions begin. The encounter with the ancestors. This is where the Bwiti initiation differs most dramatically from the traditions we have considered in earlier chapters, because the phenomenological content of the ibogaine experience is different in kind. Where a psilocybin experience tends toward abstract patterns, felt insight, and ego dissolution, an ibogaine experience is characteristically narrative. Initiates report watching a coherent, sustained visionary sequence that unfolds like a film. Fernandez's ethnographic account records participants describing extended encounters with specific ancestral figures, sometimes recognized as their own dead relatives, sometimes as more distant ancestors of the community. The initiate typically undergoes what the tradition frames as an actual death. They leave their body, they travel to the realm of the ancestors, they are received there, they are shown things, they receive specific communications from specific ancestral figures, and eventually they return. The specific content of these encounters varies from initiate to initiate, but recurring elements include encounters with relatives who have died, particularly close family members whose deaths have been recent or difficult, encounters with ancestral figures who transmit specific messages, sometimes about the initiate's specific life circumstances, and sometimes about the community's larger situation, passage through specific landscapes that the tradition recognizes and interprets, and in the final phase before return, the crossing of a threshold that is understood as the boundary between the world of the dead and the world of the living. The initiate's return through this threshold, back into their body in the Iboga, is the moment of rebirth. the moment when the death of the old self is completed by the appearance of the new self who has crossed the boundary and come back with knowledge of what lies beyond. The next morning, and often for days after, the initiate is debriefed by the Nganga and other experienced practitioners. What did you see? Who did you meet? What did they say to you? What passages did you traverse? The content of the visionary experience is not treated as private or as merely subjective. It is treated as report from a real domain, information brought back from the world of the ancestors, that must now be interpreted by those who know how to interpret such things. Specific messages received during the vision are integrated into the initiate's ongoing life, sometimes with specific action items. Reconcile with this relative, avoid this behavior, take up this responsibility. The integration is not left to the initiate to work out alone. The tradition provides trained interpreters whose role is to help the initiate make sense of what they encountered and to translate the encounter into changes in the initiate's waking life. I want to name what this looks like from inside the framework of this book, which is that the Bwiti initiation is producing exactly the kind of experience that a well-designed ritual technology built around a specific pharmacological agent would produce. The dose is substantial. The set is elaborately prepared through days or weeks of anticipation. The setting is a specifically constructed ritual space designed for exactly this purpose. The music is continuous and structured. The interpretive framework is fully developed and integrated with the tradition's cosmology. The trained interpreter is present throughout to guide the experience and integrate it afterward. The community is present to witness and validate. Every component that Chavin, Eleusis, and the Mazatec Velada stack in their own ways is stacked here, adapted to the specific pharmacology of Iboga and the specific cosmological framework of West Central African animism with ancestor veneration. And what the ceremony produces, reliably, across generations, is a specific transformation in the initiate. They become a member of the tradition. They carry the memory of having crossed into the world of the ancestors and returned. They emerge with the fear of death substantially altered. The modern medical relevance. Iboga's most significant contribution to contemporary medicine has been its efficacy in interrupting substance addiction, particularly opioid addiction. This use was documented in the West by Howard Lotsof, an American who took Iboga in 1962 as a young man seeking a novel psychedelic experience, and discovered that the compound completely eliminated his heroin withdrawal symptoms, and, more remarkably, his cravings. Lotsof spent the next several decades advocating for research into Iboga as an addiction treatment. His work has been substantiated by a growing body of clinical research showing that a single Iboga session, properly administered, can interrupt opioid dependence with a success rate that no conventional medical treatment currently approaches. The compound's mechanism appears to involve both the acute interruption of the physical withdrawal syndrome and a longer-term restructuring of the reward and motivation circuitry that maintains addictive behavior. There are safety concerns. Iboga is cardiotoxic in some individuals and has been associated with fatalities in unmonitored settings. But under proper medical supervision, the compound's therapeutic potential is now widely acknowledged. This is worth pausing on. A pharmacological intervention that reliably interrupts the deepest addictions the modern medical system knows was discovered and refined by the Bwiti tradition, using no laboratory equipment, no clinical trials, and no theoretical pharmacology over a period of centuries or millennia of iteration. What the Bwiti practitioners knew empirically was that Iboga could break patterns of attachment. That is exactly what the tradition uses it for. The death of the old self, the interruption of the ordinary continuity of identity, the return of the initiate to the path from which they had strayed. When Western medicine encounters Iboga as an addiction treatment, it is discovering in a specific clinical form what the Bwiti tradition has been doing all along. The initiation is an intervention that breaks the participant's attachment to their previous continuity of self, and one specific application of that intervention is the interruption of substance addiction. But it is not the only application. The full traditional use is broader, aimed at a general transformation that includes but is not limited to what the medical literature can currently measure. This is one of the clearest examples in the current pharmacological literature of what I mean when I claim that ancient traditions were operating a real cognitive science that modern research is rediscovering piece by piece. The Bwiti developed a specific ritual technology around a specific plant that produces a specific and unusual pharmacology. And one of the things that pharmacology does is interrupt addiction, and modern medicine is now catching up to what they were doing. The catching up is important. It validates the tradition, and it makes the compound available for populations who would not have access to Bwiti ceremony. But it should not be mistaken for discovery. The discovery was made in the Gabonese forest generations ago by practitioners who had every reason to know what they were doing. The sonic and choreographic layer. I want to say a specific word about the music of Bwiti, because it is one of the tradition's most sophisticated and least studied components. The mongongo harp is a musical bow of specific construction, a curved wooden neck with a resonator, typically played by a seated musician with a specific finger technique that produces a distinctive melodic line. In Fang Bwiti, the mongongo is central to ceremony. The specific melodies played by the mongongo master over the course of the initiation have specific ceremonial functions, marking specific ritual moments and inducing specific emotional and cognitive states in the participants. Drumming and the shakers provide rhythmic underlay. Chanting in the sacred language weaves through the whole, and dance at various points in the ceremony involves specific movements by specific participants that mark specific transitions in the ritual. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2. The Fang have another musical form, the mvet, which is simultaneously a specific instrument, a stick zither, and a genre of oral literature performed with that instrument. The mvet is used more in general ceremonial contexts than in the specific initiation, but it is part of the broader Fang musical tradition from which the Bwiti draws. The point is that the sonic environment of the Bwiti ceremony is not incidental or ambient. It is specifically composed, specifically performed, and specifically integrated with the ritual sequence. The Nganga is not simply administering Iboga to a candidate and letting the experience unfold. The Nganga is orchestrating a coordinated sonic, visual, choreographic, and pharmacological intervention in which every element has a specific role. This is engineered ecstasy in the fullest sense, a designed cognitive intervention in which the choir principle is operating at every accessible sensory channel. Registers at the established register. The pharmacology of ibogaine, as documented in the modern medical literature, the botanical identity of Tabernanthe iboga, and its distribution, the ethnographic documentation of the tradition by Fernandez, Gallenhofer, Bonhomme, and others. The ceremonial structure of the initiation, as it has been observed and recorded by trained ethnographers over the past century. The clinical efficacy of ibogaine as an anti-addiction agent, as documented in contemporary research. At the contested register, the specific antiquity of the Babongo origin of the tradition. The exact chronology of the Bwiti spread from Mitsogo to Fang. The specific mechanisms by which the ceremony produces long-term behavioral change beyond the interruption of addiction. The extent to which reports of specific ancestral encounters constitute veridical contact versus culturally shaped visionary content. At the story register, the initiate's first-person accounts of encountering their ancestors. Fernandez's documentation of specific initiation experiences in the 1960s and 1970s. The tradition's own account of Iboga as a sentient plant person. The reports of death, journey, encounter, and return that constitute the phenomenological core of the initiation. The widespread account by contemporary participants that the ceremony reliably produces experiences of encounter with specific deceased persons. The Bwiti case adds something specific to the argument this book is building. It demonstrates that the same underlying design principles, the extended preparation, the specifically constructed ritual space, the integrated musical and sonic intervention, the trained interpretive relationship, the community of witnesses, the pharmacological climax, and the structured integration apply not just to serotonergic psychedelics like psilocybin and mescaline, but to a pharmacologically unrelated compound with a completely different mechanism of action. The ritual technology is not specific to the classical psychedelics. It is a general set of design principles that maximize the effect of any sufficiently powerful psychoactive intervention on human consciousness. This has substantial implications for what Document 2 will build out. If the choir principle applies across the psychedelic class, it also applies across the broader category of psychoactive interventions, including the non-psychedelic cognitive herbs that make up the bulk of the traditional pharmacopoeias we will consider next. We turn now to the last of our 6 historical case studies, the Aztec Teonanácatl ceremony as documented by Bernardino de Sahagún in the mid-16th century, in the Nahua language and Spanish sources known collectively as the Florentine Codex. 2.6 Teonanácatl, the Aztec sacred mushroom in the Florentine Codex. In the year 1502 in the great city of Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II was crowned Huaytlatoani, the Great Speaker, the paramount ruler of the Aztec Triple Alliance and its subject peoples across most of what is now central Mexico. The coronation was a state ritual of enormous consequence, and it lasted 4 days. On the 4th day, at the culmination of the ceremonies, the new emperor and the assembled dignitaries consumed sacred mushrooms. The mushrooms were called Teonanácatl in the Nahuatl language, from Teo, divine, sacred, and Náhuatl, mushroom. The translation offered by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, the Franciscan chronicler who documented this ceremony a half-century later, has become the standard rendering in English, flesh of the gods. This is the same mushroom, or the same family of mushrooms, that Maria Sabina would administer to Gordon Wasson in Huautla de Jimenez in 1955. The pharmacology is psilocybin. The ritual application by imperial officials at the coronation of the Aztec emperor and by 20th century Mazatec curanderas is the same intervention, deployed in radically different institutional contexts, across a span of almost exactly 450 years. The continuity between Aztec Teonanácatl use and modern Mazatec practice is not accidental. When the Spanish conquest destroyed the Aztec imperial ceremonial system after 1521, and when Catholic authorities subsequently identified the mushroom ceremonies as demonic parodies of the Eucharist and moved to suppress them, the practice did not disappear. It went underground in remote mountain communities that the Spanish colonial state could not effectively police, and it re-emerged into Western awareness only in the 20th century, when Wasson followed a chain of ethnographic reports back to Huautla and located a living lineage of practitioners. What Wasson found in the Mazatec Sierra was, in a specific sense, what had been the property of Aztec state ceremony 4.5 centuries earlier, preserved through the long silence of colonial suppression. The mushrooms are the same. The ritual framework has changed, but the underlying tradition is continuous. This chapter examines what we know about the Aztec use of Teonanácatl from the surviving primary sources. It is a shorter chapter than the ones on Chavin and Eleusis, because the primary source situation is different. We have no surviving temple architecture designed around the mushroom ceremony, no chemical residue analysis of Aztec ceremonial vessels, yet this is an obvious research target for the coming decade, and no direct participant testimonies in the sense that the Rigveda or Sabina's recorded chants give us. What we do have is one of the most detailed ethnographic documents produced anywhere in the 16th century, compiled by a Franciscan missionary whose own theological purpose was to eradicate the practices he was documenting, but who was too intellectually honest to distort what his Nahua informants told him. That document is the Florentine Codex, and it is unique among the sources we have considered so far. The Florentine Codex Fray Bernardino de Sahagún arrived in Mexico in 1529, 8 years after the fall of Tenochtitlan to Hernán Cortés. He was a Franciscan friar, educated at the University of Salamanca, and by the time of his arrival, he had already committed himself to the linguistic and cultural work that would occupy the rest of his long life. From 1536, he taught at the newly founded Royal College of Santa Cruz in Tlatelolco, the first institution of higher education in the Americas after the Spanish colonization. His students were the sons of the surviving Nahua elite, trilingual in Nahuatl, Spanish, and Latin, who would become the essential collaborators for the ethnographic project he began around 1547 and pursued until his death in 1590. The methodology Sahagún developed for this project has been recognized in modern scholarship as effectively the first systematic anthropological methodology. He drafted formal questionnaires. He arranged, through local authorities, for these questionnaires to be presented to elderly Nahua experts on specific topics: religion, ritual, medicine, natural history, warfare. He conducted the interviews in Nahuatl through his trilingual students, who then transcribed the responses in both Nahuatl and Spanish. He cross-referenced testimonies from different villages and different informants, discarded material he judged inaccurate or contradictory, and preserved what could be verified from multiple sources. The whole process took approximately 30 years. The resulting document is a 12-book encyclopedia written in parallel columns of Nahuatl and Spanish, illustrated with over 2,000 images by Nahua artists trained in the Franciscan school. This is not an outsider's second-hand summary of Aztec culture. It is a collaborative production by Nahua elders and Nahua scholars, mediated by a Spanish friar who was demonstrably committed to preserving what his informants told him, rather than to imposing his own theological framework on their testimonies. The Codex has an odd survival history. It was completed around 1575 to 1577 and sent to Spain, where its contents alarmed the Council of the Indies, enough that further work on Nahuatl language materials was restricted. The manuscript eventually made its way to the Medici court in Florence, where it entered the Biblioteca Medicea Lawrenziana and sat, largely forgotten, until it was rediscovered by 19th-century scholars in 1883. The definitive modern edition, with English translation by Arthur J. O. Anderson and Charles E. Dibble, was published by the School of American Research and the University of Utah between 1950 and 1982. It runs to more than 3,000 pages in its full form. It is the most extensive ethnographic account of a non-European ritual system compiled anywhere before the modern period. For our purposes, the relevant material on Teonanácatl is concentrated in 3 books of the Codex. Book 9 discusses the Pochteca, the merchant class, and includes an extended description of a specific mushroom ceremony they performed. Book 10 covers the Nahua people generally, and includes descriptions of practitioners who use sacred plants. Book 11, the longest and most heavily illustrated volume, is titled Earthly Things, and includes the fullest natural history description of Teonanácatl, including its physical characteristics, its effects, and its ritual and medicinal uses. What Sahagún records about the mushroom, Book 11 of the Codex describes Teonanácatl with a precision that any modern ethnobotanist can appreciate. The Nahuatl language description in the Anderson-Dibble translation reads, "It is called Teonanácatl. It grows on the plains in the grass. The head is small and round. The stem is long and slender. It is bitter and burns. It burns the throat. It makes one besotted. It deranges one, troubles one. It is a remedy for fever, for gout. Only 2 or 3 can be eaten. It saddens, depresses, troubles one. It makes one flee, frightens, makes one hide." Everything in this passage is accurate. The species that grow in this ecological niche, including Psilocybe mexicana and Psilocybe asticorum, the latter named for its Aztec ritual use, are indeed small, round-capped, slender-stemmed grassland mushrooms. They are indeed bitter. The dose specification of 2 or 3 matches the pairing convention in the Codex illustrations and matches modern Mazatec practice. The medicinal indications, fever, gout, are documented uses within the broader Mesoamerican medical tradition. The description of the psychological effects is, by modern clinical standards, accurate. At threshold doses, psilocybin can indeed produce dysphoria, anxiety, and a desire to withdraw from social contact. which is why modern clinical protocols emphasize careful dose management and supportive setting. Sahagún's Nawa informants were telling him what happened when the mushrooms were used improperly or without preparation, and Sahagún preserved their testimony without editorial adjustment. The description is diagnostic. If you have ever consumed psilocybin in a bad setting, you know what Book 11 is describing. The illustrations of Teonanácatl in the Codex are worth attention on their own. In several images, the mushrooms are painted in the sacred color of jade green, a color that indicated divinity in Aztec iconography, and that was reserved for the most highly valued sacred objects. In the illustration accompanying Book 11's description, an eerie figure hovers above a Nanacatl mushroom, indicating the plant's capacity to open doors to non-ordinary reality. A parallel illustration in the Codex Magliabecchiano, an independent 16th-century pictographic manuscript, shows a seated figure consuming a pair of mushrooms, while Mictlantecuhtli, the Lord of the Dead, touches his head from behind. The mushroom encounter is depicted, iconographically, as an encounter with death itself, mediated by the plant. The visual convention of representing the mushrooms in pairs, which appears consistently across Aztec-derived imagery, corresponds to the Book 11 dose specification and to the modern Mazatec tradition of consuming mushrooms as male-female pairs. This is one of the specific continuities that lets us trace the tradition across 5 centuries. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 12. The Merchant Ceremony in Book 9. The most extended ritual description in the Sahagún corpus appears in Book 9, in the section on the Pochteca, the merchant class. The Pochteca were a distinct professional group in Aztec society, engaged in long-distance trade that took them for extended periods into regions far from Tenochtitlan. They had their own patron deities, their own guild organization, their own ritual calendar, and their own ceremonial obligations. When a merchant returned safely from a long trading expedition, or when the community wished to celebrate the successful conclusion of a season's trade, a specific mushroom ceremony was performed. Sahagún's description of this ceremony, again in the Anderson-Dibble translation of Book 9, includes the following. At the very first, mushrooms had been served. They ate them at the time when the shell trumpets were blown. They ate no more food, they only drank chocolate during the night. And they ate the mushrooms with honey. When the mushrooms took effect on them, then they danced, then they wept. But some, while still in command of their senses, entered a place, and sat there by the house on their seats. They did no more, but only sat there nodding. Several details in this passage are worth attending to. The mushrooms are served at the very beginning of the ceremony, before the food, which corresponds to the pharmacological reality that psilocybin's effects come on within 30 to 45 minutes, and consuming food during this onset period reduces the intensity of the experience. Honey is added, a standard practice for masking the bitterness of the mushrooms that is documented across virtually every Mesoamerican mushroom tradition and continues in modern Mazatec practice. Chocolate is consumed during the night. Chocolate, in the Aztec preparation, contained not only cacao, but often chili, vanilla, achiote, and other admixtures. It was a stimulating and psychoactive beverage in its own right. And its role during the mushroom ceremony was probably to provide sustained mild activation across the long night without introducing solid food. The description continues with what participants experienced under the mushroom's effect. One saw in vision that already he would die, and then continued weeping. One saw that he would die in battle. One saw that he would be devoured by wild beasts. One saw that he would take captives in war. One saw that he would be rich, wealthy. One saw that he would buy slaves, he would be a slave owner. One saw that he would commit adultery, and so would be struck with stones, would be stoned to death. One saw that he would steal, he too would be stoned. One saw that his head would be crushed by stones, they would condemn him. One saw that he would perish in the water. One saw that he would live in peace, in tranquility, until he died. One saw that he would fall from a roof, he would fall to his death. What Sahagún preserved from his Nahua informants is that the mushroom experience, in the ceremonial context, was frequently divinatory. Participants received visions of their future fates, and these visions were authoritative pronouncements about what would in fact come to pass. The specific range of contents that Sahagún records is also notable: violent death, wealth, sexual transgression, punishment, peaceful old age. This is a functional divinatory ritual, structured around the pharmacological event, in which the trance state produced by the mushrooms was being interpreted as a channel for information about the participant's individual fate. The interpretive framework was fully developed and integrated with the tradition's cosmology. The visions were not treated as noise, they were treated as data. The ceremony's conclusion, as Sahagún describes it, involved participants sharing their visions with each other after the effect had subsided. Those who had received hopeful visions rejoiced. Those who had received frightening ones wept and sought consolation. The community as a whole engaged with what the mushrooms had revealed, and the specific pronouncements received during the ceremony were remembered and referred back to over time. This is exactly the pattern we have seen in the other traditions: pharmacological event, followed by structured integration, in which the experience is interpreted by trained members of the community and folded into the participants' ongoing life. Xochipilli and the wider ritual complex. Teonanácatl was not the only sacred plant in Aztec religion, and the mushroom ceremony was not an isolated ritual. It was part of a larger complex of practices centered on a deity called Xochipilli, the flower prince, patron of songs, dance, art, games, flowers, and altered states of consciousness. Xochipilli's iconography, most famously preserved in a stone sculpture now housed at the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, depicts a seated figure in ecstatic posture whose body is covered with carved reliefs of specific psychoactive plants: Teonanácatl, tobacco flower, morning glory, Ololiuqui, whose scenes contain LSA, and others. The sculpture is a catalogue of the Aztec psychoactive pharmacopoeia, arranged around the figure of the god who presided over its use. The wider complex included several other pharmacological interventions. Ololiuqui, Turbina corymbosa seeds, containing LSA, the same lysergic acid amide the 2026 Antonopoulos and Dadiotis study demonstrated could be produced from ergot, were used divinatorily by specialists called Paini, one who drinks medicine. Peyote, Peyodal, Lophophora williamsi, containing mescaline, was known, but was primarily associated with the more northern peoples like the Chichimeque and later the Huichol. Tobacco, Pichetl, used in a substantially more potent form than modern smoked tobacco, played a role in nearly every Aztec ritual context, and functioned as both a psychoactive and a sacred plant in its own right. Salvia divinorum, containing salvinorin A, was known in southern Mexico and continues in ceremonial use among the Mazatec today. Toad venom, containing bufotoxins and possibly 5-MeO-DMT, was used in some contexts. What the Aztec pharmacopoeia represents, taken together, is one of the most extensive documented collections of psychoactive plant knowledge assembled by any pre-modern culture. The specialists who understood these plants and knew how to use them ritually. The Engineered Ecstasy. Listening Script, Part 2, 14 and medicinally were part of the wider Aztec medical tradition, and they operated with a body of empirical pharmacological knowledge that in specific areas, mushroom identification, dose management, ritual integration, was probably more sophisticated than anything available in contemporary 16th century European medicine. The suppression and the underground survival. When the Spanish established colonial control after 1521, the mushroom ceremonies, along with virtually every other element of Aztec religious practice, were identified as satanic and marked for eradication. The mushroom ceremony was particularly offensive to Catholic authorities because of its structural resemblance to the Eucharist. Both involved a sacred substance consumed ritually. Both were understood by their practitioners to bring the participant into direct contact with the divine. The Franciscan and Dominican chroniclers who documented the mushroom ceremonies used the parallel explicitly, describing Teonanácatl as a demonic communion, a satanic parody of the true sacrament. The Church responded with formal prohibition, with public burnings of native religious manuscripts, and with sustained inquisitorial pressure against practitioners who continued the ceremonies clandestinely. The suppression was largely effective in the urban and lowland areas that the colonial state could effectively police. It was less effective in the remote mountainous regions of Oaxaca, Puebla, and Guerrero, where communities that had never been fully integrated into the Aztec imperial system continued their local practices in relative isolation. The Mazatec Sierra was one such region. Others included the Chinantec, the Mique, the Zapotec, and various other Oaxacan and Chiapan peoples who preserved sacred mushroom traditions through the entire colonial and post-colonial period. What Wasson encountered in Huautla in 1955 was one surviving lineage of what had once been a much wider tradition, most of which had been extinguished by 4 centuries of religious persecution. The Sahagún record is crucial here. Without the Florentine Codex, we would have no adequate documentation of the pre-conquest Aztec use of Teonanácatl. The specific ceremonial details, the dose specifications, the phenomenological content of the visions, the integration of the mushroom ritual into the wider religious and social system, all of this would be lost. The Codex sat in the Florentine library for 3 centuries, and it was rediscovered in 1883. It began to make available a body of pre-conquest ethnographic material that no other source could have provided. Wasson's 1955 encounter with Sabina was intellectually possible because the Codex had by then been available to scholars for several decades and had established that the mushroom tradition was ancient, elaborate, and continuous with something that might still be found somewhere in the mountains of southern Mexico. Sahagún saved the tradition in a specific sense by documenting it accurately enough that when the physical practice was eventually rediscovered, we could recognize what we were seeing. The Deep Antiquity, the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 15. The Teonanácatl tradition, as documented in Sahagún, is Aztec, meaning it belongs to the specific imperial civilization that dominated central Mexico between roughly 1350 and 1521. But the practice is substantially older than the Aztec Triple Alliance. Archaeological and iconographic evidence indicates that sacred mushroom use in Mesoamerica goes back at least 3,000 years. The famous mushroom stones of the Maya highlands, small carved stone objects in the shape of mushrooms with human or animal figures at the base, have been dated as early as 1000 BCE and are widely interpreted as ceremonial objects associated with mushroom ritual. Similar iconographic evidence exists in the Olmec heartland and in various post-classic contexts across Mesoamerica. When the Aztec imperial system incorporated the mushroom ceremony into its state ritual, it was drawing on a much older regional tradition that predates the empire by at least 2 millennia. The full pre-Aztec history of sacred mushroom use in Mesoamerica is imperfectly documented and remains an active area of research. What we can say with confidence is that Teonanácatl was not an Aztec invention. It was inherited from earlier Mesoamerican peoples, refined and elaborated by successive imperial and religious institutions, formalized in the Aztec ceremonial system that Sahagún documented, and preserved in fragmentary form through the colonial suppression into the 20th century Mazatec revival. The tradition is one of the oldest continuously practiced ritual technologies of consciousness we have record of anywhere in the world. It is also, in its Aztec form, one of the most extensively documented, thanks to the extraordinary 16th century ethnographic work of Sahagún and his Nahuatl collaborators. What the Aztec case adds, I want to name specifically what this case study contributes to the argument of the book, because it is not simply an additional data point. First, the Aztec Teonanácatl material demonstrates that sacred mushroom ritual was not a marginal or peripheral practice in Mesoamerican civilization. It was part of state ceremony. The emperor's coronation involved it. The merchants' guild practiced it. The wider religious system incorporated it under the patronage of a specific deity. This was not a shamanic tradition surviving in remote areas that happened to intersect briefly with high civilization. It was integral to one of the most sophisticated civilizations of the pre-Columbian Americas. The intellectual seriousness of the tradition matches the intellectual seriousness of the civilization that transmitted it. Second, the Aztec case establishes the specific continuity between the imperial ceremony of 1502 and the Mazatec practice of 1955. The mushrooms are the same. The pairing convention is the same. The honey-mediated consumption is the same. The interpretive framework in which the visions are received as communications from the sentient plant teacher is the same. 450 years of colonial suppression and imperial collapse did not sever the tradition. What Wasson recorded in Huautla is direct descent from what Sahagún recorded in the 16th century. This is not an ordinary, the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 216, case of cultural persistence. It is the survival of a specific ritual technology across the collapse of the civilization that had most fully institutionalized it. Third, the Sahagún corpus itself demonstrates something important about how these traditions can be preserved, even in situations of hostile external documentation. Sahagún was, formally, engaged in a project of Christian evangelization aimed at eradicating the practices he was documenting. But his intellectual honesty in preserving what his informants told him, the specific dose, the specific phenomenology, the specific ceremonial sequence, the specific interpretive framework, produced a record that 4 centuries later has proven to be the essential reference for understanding a tradition that has now re-emerged into legitimate scholarly and clinical interest. Sahagún's methodology matters. What he did with his Nahua Mayan mushroom stones blogspot.com, and in the broader Mesoamerican archaeological literature. Collaborators became a model that modern anthropology would only slowly rediscover. And what he preserved has become the bridge between a suppressed pre-conquest tradition and a modern scientific engagement with the same pharmacology. Registers. At the established register, the Florentine Codex as ethnographic source, its authorship, its methodology, and its content. The pharmacology of psilocybin, the specific ceremonial elements documented in books 9, 10, and 11. The continuity with modern Mazatec practice through convergent details of dose, preparation, and interpretive framework. The deeper Mesoamerican antiquity of sacred mushroom use as attested by iconographic and archaeological evidence. At the contested register, the specific antiquity and distribution of the Aztec mushroom tradition prior to the imperial period. The extent to which the Sahagún record represents the full elite Aztec ceremonial use versus a partial or selective account. The specific relationships between the various sacred plants, Teonanácatl, Ololeuki, Peyote, Piquiatl, in integrated ritual contexts. The exact chemical composition of ceremonial chocolate preparations, and their potential role in modifying the mushroom experience. At the story register, the vision content documented in Book 9, including the specific range of futures perceived by participants. The depiction of the mushroom encounter as an encounter with Mictlantecuhtli, the Lord of the Dead. The tradition's own account of the mushrooms as sentient beings and divine flesh. The persistence of specific phenomenological reports across the 4.5 centuries between the Sahagún documentation and the Wasson recordings. The Aztec Teonanácatl case closes the historical arc of Part 2. We have now examined 6 independent ritual traditions on 4 continents: the Andean Chavin, the Greek Eleusinian, the Indian Vedic, the Mazatec, the Central African Bwiti, and the Aztec, each of which independently developed integrated ritual technologies for the deliberate transformation of human consciousness. Each used a different plant, each was embedded in a different cosmology, each was formalized within a different institutional context, and each, in its own way, converged on the same underlying design principles: extended preparation, engineered ritual space, coordinated sensory intervention, trained interpretive relationship, pharmacological climax, and structured integration afterward. This convergence is the empirical foundation for the choir principle laid out in Part 1. 6 independent cultures cannot be doing the same thing by accident. We turn next to a 7th case, one that differs from the 6 historical traditions in a specific way. It is contemporary. It is documented in real time by the practitioner himself, and it emerged without direct knowledge of any of the historical traditions. Section 2.7 examines the manuscript of a modern practitioner who independently converged on the same design principles the historical traditions had developed, and treats that convergent rediscovery as the strongest available evidence that the underlying framework is real. 2.7 Contemporary Rediscovery, a modern practitioner's independent convergence on ritual stacking. The framework this book is building rests on a specific empirical claim, and I have not yet fully tested it. The claim is that the design principles the historical traditions arrived at are not cultural artifacts, but discoveries, that they are properties of the underlying human nervous system and its response to specific psychoactive interventions, that they can therefore be independently rediscovered by any sufficiently attentive practitioner working from scratch, and that when we see the same design principles emerging across cultures that had no contact with one another, we are seeing convergent discovery of the same underlying reality. This is a strong claim. It is falsifiable. If ritual technology were purely a matter of cultural transmission, if the Chavin priests had figured out something specific to Andean cosmology, and the Eleusinian priestesses had figured out something specific to Mediterranean grain culture, and the Nambudiri Brahmins had figured out something specific to Vedic Sanskrit metaphysics, and none of these were expressions of a shared underlying set of design principles, then a modern practitioner working with no knowledge of any of these traditions ought to arrive at completely different results. If, on the other hand, the design principles are real in the sense the framework claims, then a modern practitioner working from scratch, paying careful attention to what makes the effect reliable versus unreliable, ought to converge on principles that map recognizably onto the historical traditions. The purpose of this chapter is to test that prediction. The test case is a manuscript by a contemporary practitioner named Fletcher, written between 2018 and 2023, documenting a series of psychedelic experiences and the specific ritual protocols he developed around them. The manuscript is a primary source in exactly the same sense that Sahagún's account of the merchant ceremony is a primary source, or Sabina's recorded chants are a primary source, or Fernandez's field notes on Feng Bwiti initiations are a primary source. It is the practitioner's own, contemporaneous documentation of what he did, what he experienced, and what he learned. The methodological difference is that Fletcher was documenting his own iterative discovery process in real time, rather than transmitting an inherited tradition, which makes his manuscript particularly valuable for the argument I am about to make. It captures the process of convergent rediscovery as it happened. I want to be specific about what makes this test rigorous. Fletcher, at the time he began the practice documented in the manuscript, had no meaningful prior knowledge of any of the 6 historical traditions this book has just examined. His starting frame was Western contemporary spiritual culture, some exposure to Rosicrucian material through a local esoteric community, some familiarity with the popular literature on quantum physics and consciousness, some contact with the online psychedelic subculture. He was not attempting to reconstruct Chavin, Eleusis, or the Mazatec Velada. He was trying to figure out empirically what made his LSD and mushroom experiences reliably transformative versus reliably mediocre. Over a period of several years, through a documented series of iterations, he converged on a specific protocol that includes small group size, intimate emotional connection with the co-participant, prepared physical environment, dietary restrictions before the ceremony, specific sound frequencies, chanted vowel sounds at specific musical notes, mudra practice, breath work, sacred geometry, specifically a pyramid, mirror work, structured post-experience integration through journaling, and an interpretive framework that treats the experience as encounter with intelligent non-ordinary entities and forces. Every element of this protocol maps recognizably onto one or more of the historical traditions we have examined. Fletcher arrived at all of it through iteration on his own experience. This is the convergent rediscovery the framework predicts. This chapter walks through the material, applying the same established, contested story framework the historical chapters have used, and reads Fletcher's manuscript with the same phenomenological seriousness I have given to Sabina's chants, the Rigvedic Soma hymns, and the Bwiti initiate reports. Nothing will be dismissed. Nothing will be uncritically asserted at the metaphysical level. What Fletcher reports experiencing will be preserved in his own words, framed as phenomenological data, and connected where possible to modern research that illuminates the neural mechanisms involved. This is the treatment academic religious studies gives to phenomenological reports from any tradition. And I want to be explicit that the reason I am applying it to Fletcher's material is not that his tradition is uniquely credible or uniquely suspect, but that the framework of this book requires consistency. If I take Sabina's Principle 1 seriously as phenomenological data, I have to take Fletcher's face portal encounters seriously by the same standard. Doing otherwise would be to smuggle in a metaphysical prejudice under the cover of academic caution. The starting point. Fletcher's early experiences, documented in the opening chapters of the manuscript, follow a pattern that will be familiar to anyone who has encountered contemporary Western psychedelic use in its casual form. Half a tab of LSD at age 15, in a friend's basement in suburban Illinois, produced what Fletcher describes as an emotional trip with limited visuals but a specific and memorable insight. A subsequent experience with morning glory seeds, which contain the same LSA alkaloids that both the Eleusinian ergot preparation and Aztec Ololiuqui ritual used, produced what he calls certainly a fucking trip, but without the transformative depth he was seeking. A later, more visually intense trip at age 16, in the context of a rave in Chicago with 3 high school friends, produced a strong pharmacological experience, but again, without the depth of transformation Fletcher would later come to recognize as characteristic of properly framed psychedelic work. These early experiences are important for the argument because they establish Fletcher's baseline. This is what psychedelic use looks like without the ritual technology. The dose is present. The molecule is doing what the molecule does. The experience is real, sometimes memorable, occasionally profound. But it is not what the historical traditions were producing. It is what happens when you take the substance without the choir. Fletcher himself, looking back on these early experiences, recognized that something was missing. I had a lot of trips like that on LSD and mushrooms. Something happens once you've had a spiritual awakening. The psychedelics aren't just a high, they're a temporary gateway into 4D consciousness. A cool thing happens once you break the veil with someone you vibe with. The phrase "break the veil," which recurs throughout the manuscript, is Fletcher's own term for the specific class of transformative experience he was iterating toward. It maps recognizably onto what the Eleusinian tradition called epopteia, the seeing. It maps onto what the Bwiti initiation calls the encounter with the ancestors. It maps onto what the Aztec merchant ceremony called the visions of one's fate. Different names, arrived at independently, for what the framework of this book suggests is the same class of phenomenon. The specific altered state that emerges when the pharmacological event is embedded in a properly designed ritual container. The turning point. The manuscript identifies a specific experience in 2018 as the moment when Fletcher's practice shifted from casual recreational use to iterative ritual development. This experience, involving a 2-tab dose of LSD in his room in Los Angeles with a partner who had been intended as a sober sitter, produced what Fletcher describes as his first veil-breaking event. His description of what followed the onset is worth preserving in his own words. I go to put my headphones in, turn on some binaural beats, and try to sync my brain to the universe, just enough to see if God is real. I begin to see and feel the air all around me, and notice it as a living being. It freaks me out a bit at first. Before I can even unlock my phone, I look up at my girlfriend. Her eyes are wide. It's happening. You're channeling. The energy in the room changes, and she begins speaking in third person. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 2. What Fletcher reports next includes phenomena that he had not previously experienced and that he was, at the moment they were happening, unequipped to interpret. He describes the emergence of what he perceived as an intelligent presence speaking through his partner, engaging him in dialogue, teaching him a specific practice around breath and energy balancing between the two of them. He describes a face portal phenomenon in which looking at his partner opened what he perceived as a channel through which he could see her as different faces, different beings, different lives. He describes a moment when her skin appeared to change colors sequentially: white, purple, green, purple with white stripes, purple and green, in the form of what looked like a dinosaur-like being, before returning to her ordinary appearance. He describes his subsequent telepathic experience of her inner emotions becoming his outer emotions. I want to be specific about the phenomenological analysis of this material. Every element Fletcher reports in this passage maps onto categories of experience that are well documented in the cross-cultural literature on ritual psychedelic use. The perception of the air as a living presence corresponds to what the animist traditions call the general ensoulment of the environment. The channeling of an intelligent voice through the partner corresponds to what Sabina reported when the Niños Santos spoke through her, and to what Bwiti initiates report when their ancestors speak to them, and to what the Chavin architects were probably staging with the Lanzon oracle. In which the partner appears as a sequence of different beings corresponds to Bwiti reports of the initiate seeing others as animal-human hybrid beings during the peak of Iboga, and to Aztec reports of seeing others as their Nahuali, animal spirit selves, and to the more general phenomenon reported across many traditions in which the boundaries of ordinary personal identity dissolve, and the person perceived is seen as continuous with a range of other identities. The telepathic connection between Fletcher and his partner corresponds to what Fernandez documented in Bwiti Initiation as the specific intersubjective attunement that emerges between initiate and Nganga during the peak of the ceremony. None of this means Fletcher's specific interpretations of what he was experiencing are correct as metaphysical claims about the external world. It does mean that what he was experiencing was not idiosyncratic or unprecedented. He was encountering a class of phenomena that human beings under high-dose classical psychedelic influence, in appropriately configured social and physical settings, have been encountering for at least 3,000 years across every culture we have documentation for. He was, without knowing it, entering the same territory the historical traditions had mapped. The critical feature of this experience, for our argument, is what Fletcher did with it afterward. He did not simply have the experience and move on. He noticed which conditions had made it possible: the presence of binaural beats, the specific intention to make contact, the intimate emotional bond with his co-participant, the enclosed private setting. He began, from that point forward, to attempt to reproduce the conditions that had produced the veil breaking. He kept detailed notes. When subsequent trips failed to produce the same depth, he documented what had been different. When particular protocol adjustments produced increased depth, he documented that too. Over the following several years, this iterative methodology produced the specific protocol the manuscript records. The design principles Fletcher converged on. By the time the manuscript reaches its middle sections, Fletcher has converged on a set of specific practices that he uses consistently to structure his ceremonies. I want to lay these out systematically and show, for each, the historical tradition or traditions it maps onto. Small group size. Fletcher's most reliably transformative experiences occurred with a single co-participant, and secondarily with 3 or 4 people who all knew each other well. His early experiments with larger groups, including one attempted ceremony with a partner and a mutual friend who was not participating in the substance, produced disruption and confusion rather than depth. His conclusion is stated flatly: the first time you do this, I suggest limiting the experience to 2 people. You will need to get used to this and let go of the initial fear if you would like to facilitate this in bigger groups. This maps directly onto the Mazatec Velada, which is a small group intimate ceremony rather than a mass gathering, and onto the specific interpersonal configuration of the Bwiti initiation, in which the Nganga and initiate are the primary dyad, even when the community is present. Intimate emotional connection with co-participants. Fletcher's protocol requires that co-participants be people the practitioner deeply loves and trusts. His explicit statement, "The number one most important thing is to absolutely love the person you're with and have a stress-free time that highlights how much you love and appreciate each other. This maps onto the Kapchuk decomposition of the placebo response, in which the supportive interpersonal relationship is one of the three independent causal components of therapeutic effect. It also maps onto the specific social configuration of the Mazatec Velada, where the participants are typically family members and close acquaintances, not strangers. Prepared physical environment. Fletcher's ceremonies take place in a specifically prepared space, typically his own bedroom, which he consecrates for the purpose through the presence of crystals, an altar, images of deities and yantras, and specific cleaning rituals. He describes multiple instances in which he felt compelled to clean the room thoroughly before a ceremony could proceed, understanding this cleaning as itself a ritual preparation. This maps onto every one of the historical traditions we have examined. The Ibanza of Bwiti, the Telesterion of Eleusis, the underground galleries of Chavin, the domestic ritual space of the Mazatec Velada. All are specifically prepared physical environments distinct from ordinary living space. Dietary restrictions before the ceremony. Fletcher documents multiple experiments with pre-ceremony eating and consistently arrives at the conclusion that fasting or minimal eating for hours before the ceremony substantially increases the depth of the experience, while overeating before the ceremony flattens it. His conclusion: eating before a trip will cut the effects of the psychedelics by over 50%. This maps onto Eleusis, the day of the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 2, 22, Fasting in Imitation of Demeter's Grief. Onto Bwiti, dietary restrictions during the preparation phase. Onto Mazatec, abstinence from specific foods before ceremony. And onto the general Andean Huachumero tradition, fasts of 12 to 24 hours before San Pedro ceremonies. Specific sound frequencies. Fletcher's protocol includes 432 Hz music and specific solfeggio frequencies as ambient sound during the ceremony. His first veil-breaking experience specifically involved binaural beats. Subsequent ceremonies used what he calls properly attuned music, meaning music tuned to specific frequencies that Western contemporary alternative music culture considers therapeutic. Whether the specific frequency claims from that culture are supported by rigorous research is contested. What is not contested is that specific sonic environments modulate the psychedelic experience, and that the Chavin Pututus at 110 Hz produced a documented hemispheric shift effect, and that Sanskrit mantra recitation, Mazatec chanting, and Bwiti Mongongo harp music all constitute engineered sonic interventions built into their respective ceremonies. Fletcher independently converged on the general principle that specific sound is part of the ritual technology, even if his specific frequency claims fall in the contested register. Chanted vowel sounds at specific musical notes. This is perhaps the most striking single instance of convergent rediscovery in the manuscript. Fletcher learned, through Rosicrucian material, a set of 7 sacred vowel sounds assigned to specific musical notes: me to C, om to D, kai to E, tho to F sharp, I to G, ra ma to A, aim to B. He experimented with these during trips and reported that hitting the correct note while chanting the correct vowel produced specific visible effects on his co-participants: perception of colored auras, activation of what he understood as chakra points, altered energetic states. The specific vowel and note system Fletcher used is one particular Western esoteric transmission, and the specific correspondences he claims between vowels, notes, and physiological effects fall in the contested register. But the underlying principle, that specific vocal sounds at specific pitches, sustained during a psychedelic ceremony, produce specific effects on participants, is precisely what Vedic mantra recitation is doing, what Mazatec chanting is doing, what Bwiti Mongongo music is doing, and what the priests at Eleusis were doing with the legomena. Fletcher independently arrived at the recognition that voice at pitch is engineered ritual technology. Mudra practice. Fletcher's ceremonies include specific hand positions, most consistently prana mudra, and less consistently vayu mudra, Matangi Mudra, and Yoni Mudra held during particular moments in the ceremony. He reports specific effects associated with each mudra. Mudra practice is inherited from the Tantric Hindu tradition and has been extensively documented in the classical Indian ritual and yogic literature. Fletcher did not develop mudra practice from scratch. He adopted it from available sources. What is notable is that he found it to substantially augment the depth of his ceremonies, and that his own practice with mudras converges with the way mudras are used in the surviving Vedic tradition, as specific gestural interventions that recruit specific effects on the practitioner's state during other ritual activity. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 23 Breathwork. Fletcher documents a daily Qigong practice that includes specific breathwork, and his ceremonies incorporate the Qigong 6 healing sounds and other structured breathing patterns. This maps onto the Vedic pranayama tradition and onto the general observation across traditions that breath is a specific ritual technology. The physiological effects of specific breathing patterns on autonomic nervous system function, heart rate variability, and cortical activity are extensively documented in contemporary research. Grounding in nature. Fletcher's protocol emphasizes spending time in outdoor natural settings during the come-up phase of the ceremony, standing barefoot on the ground for what he calls electron transfer, and interacting with trees and other plants. This maps onto the pre-ritual pilgrimage phase of Eleusis, in which the participants spent days walking through the natural landscape between Athens and Eleusis, and onto the general Andean tradition of pre-ceremony walks and mountain fasts. It also has independent contemporary support in the research on the physiological effects of grounding or earthing on inflammation, sleep, and cortisol regulation. Pyramid geometry. Fletcher constructed a 5-foot pyramid of PVC pipe at a 76-degree angle, following Russian pyramid research, and used it as a sacred space during specific ceremony phases. He reports that sitting inside the pyramid substantially deepens his meditative state, both during sober practice and during ceremony. The specific effects of pyramid geometry on consciousness are contested in the contemporary literature. What is not contested is that specifically constructed sacred geometry, the falcon altar of the Vedic Agnikayana, the trapezoidal Mahavedi of the Vedic ritual complex, the circular sunken plaza and U-shaped old temple of Chavin, the square telesterion of Eleusis, is a design element that every one of the historical traditions we have examined incorporates in some form. Fletcher independently arrived at the intuition that constructed geometric space is part of the ritual technology, even if his specific pyramid claims fall in the contested register. Mirror work. Fletcher's protocol includes specific mirror-based practices during the peak of the ceremony, in which he holds mudras while looking at his own reflection and reports seeing his face morph into what he perceives as different past life identities, animal-human hybrid forms, and other beings. Mirror work is a documented ritual technology in multiple traditions. Aztec scrying with obsidian mirrors, the reflective black surface of coal mirrors at Chavin, the mirrors in the Bwiti Iboga, and Fletcher independently arrived at the same intuition that mirror-mediated self-perception during peak psychedelic effect produces a specific class of transformative experience. Structured post-experience integration through journaling. Fletcher documents every ceremony with detailed notes, date, dose, participants, protocol elements used, phenomenological content, dietary state, mood, subsequent effects. The manuscript itself is the accumulated record of this integration practice. This maps onto the interpretive integration phase of every historical tradition we have examined. The debriefing with the Nganga the morning after Bwiti initiation. The discussion among initiates after the Eleusinian revelation. The community discussion of vision content after the Mazatec Velada. The poetry recitation and communal engagement after the Vedic Soma sacrifice. Integration is not a modern innovation. It is a component of the ritual technology across every tradition, and Fletcher independently arrived at the same recognition that undocumented and unintegrated experience is substantially less transformative than experience worked with afterward. The phenomenological content. I now turn to the story register material in Fletcher's manuscript. Applying the same treatment academic religious studies gives to Sabina's principal ones and the Bwiti ancestor encounters. What follows preserves Fletcher's own accounts of what he experienced during ceremony, framed as phenomenological data, without asserting or denying corresponding metaphysical claims. Fletcher reports repeated experiences of telepathic contact with his co-participants during ceremony. He describes moments when his internal emotional states became externally visible to his partner, when his partner's inner thoughts were audible to him as her outer speech, when specific mutual perceptions occurred that would be difficult to explain through ordinary communication. These reports are consistent across multiple ceremonies with multiple co-participants over the years the manuscript documents. His description of one specific instance. Suddenly she just kind of starts voicing my thoughts. Not verbatim, but enough to know we had just linked telepathically. My inner emotions would become her outer emotions. Fletcher reports repeated experiences of what he calls face portal or full-body morphing, in which looking at his co-participant during the peak of the ceremony reveals what he perceives as sequences of different faces, different beings, different lives. He describes these not as random hallucinations, but as coherent glimpses of what he understands as the participants' past lives, spirit animal aspects, or other beings connected to their soul. His description of one particularly detailed instance. This time I fully became him. As I began to change into him, I could feel the ether around me expand, as if my own body was expanding out wider and longer to fit the frame of this large man. I could feel his outfit sway with my movement. Every sense was engaged. As my face became his, I could feel it change on my own face. Fletcher reports repeated experiences of contact with what he perceives as intelligent non-ordinary entities during ceremony. These include specific figures he identifies as guides, the cow god, the bull, various ancestral presences, and more general perceptions of entity presence in the ritual space. His most detailed account involves what he identifies as the same being that first channeled through his partner during the 2018 veil-breaking experience, subsequently returning during later ceremonies. Suddenly I see a flash in her eye, and feel as if something is being channeled through her. Moonshine had not only accessed higher consciousness, but a whole other entity. And not any entity, the same one that tried to speak to me through my ex all those years ago. Fletcher reports repeated experiences of visual perception of what he calls the electric highway, an outline and color pattern he perceives on living beings during the ceremony that he identifies as an energetic layer of biological function. He reports being able to draw this pattern afterward, and reports that his drawings become psychically active when viewed during subsequent ceremonies. He reports perceiving auras around living beings, seeing specific colors he interprets according to chakra correspondences, and observing what he calls the rainbow body phenomenon, the appearance of another person during peak ceremony as pure multicolored light rather than as ordinary embodied form. Fletcher reports experiences of the death of the old self and rebirth pattern, most explicitly during high-dose ceremonies, in which he perceives himself as leaving his body, traveling through what he perceives as different dimensions or timelines, and returning to his body with a felt sense of having been transformed. He describes one such experience in explicit language. For a moment, I knew perfection. The breathy chants take on a different energy, and suddenly I am singing in a way I've never sang, doing things with my voice I've never done. And for the first time, truly recognizing myself, my people, my tribe, knowing full well I came back on purpose, and we are getting this shit done this time. Every one of these phenomenological reports has direct correspondence in the historical traditions we have examined. The telepathic experience corresponds to Bwiti initiate reports of intersubjective attunement with the Nganga. The face portal morphing corresponds to Bwiti reports of the perception of others as ancestral or animal hybrid beings, to Aztec reports of Nahuali perception, and to the general animist claim that persons are continuous with a wider range of identities than ordinary perception reveals. The entity contact corresponds to Sabina's principal ones, to Bwiti ancestral encounters, to Aztec merchant ceremony vision content, and to the Eleusinian epoptea in which participants reported encounter with the divine. The aura and rainbow body perception corresponds to the Tibetan Buddhist tradition of rainbow body, to Ayurvedic subtle body theory, and to a range of other traditions in which visual perception of others' energetic states during altered consciousness is treated as data rather than as illusion. The death and rebirth pattern corresponds to Bwiti initiation, to the Eleusinian dissolution of death fear, and to the Rigvedic Amrita declaration. Fletcher was not attempting to reproduce any of these historical patterns. He did not know they existed in the specific forms he was arriving at. He was reporting in real time what he was experiencing during ceremonies whose protocol he had developed by iterative empirical adjustment. What he was experiencing, when reported honestly, turns out to be recognizable across the historical traditions. This is what convergent rediscovery looks like from the inside. The self-corrections, the engineered ecstasy. Listening script, Part 2, 26. I want to address one further aspect of the manuscript because it speaks to Fletcher's epistemic honesty and therefore to the reliability of his reports as data. The manuscript does not only document successful ceremonies, it documents failures, misinterpretations, and self-corrections in real time. In one extended passage, Fletcher describes a difficult experience in which he attempted a full-dose ceremony while underfed and emotionally activated from an earlier traumatic event, resulting in what he characterizes as a bad trip characterized by paranoid delusions about aliens, government surveillance, and relationship insecurity. He then explicitly documents his analysis of what went wrong. We were tripping very late at night, and I had a light dinner the night before, and no food all day or night the day of the trip. This was far too little food and was a major player in this freakout. Eating too much will cut the effects of the psychedelics and your body's ability to achieve higher consciousness. But eating way too little can drive you into a bad trip. In a later passage, Fletcher explicitly walks back some of his earlier interpretations, acknowledging that he had gotten too up my own ass during a period of very frequent ceremony work, and that the veil-breaking he had achieved required ongoing maintenance through daily practice, or it would gradually fade. He notes specific instances in which he had over-attributed particular experiences to specific causes, and later revised his interpretation. In the closing section of the manuscript he writes, "I wrote this without very much editing, so you can see exactly who I was when I started and when I ended it. Therefore some things I have said in the book I don't necessarily believe in now. I think it's important to leave this in the journey of the book though, because it's important to see how far up your own ass you can get while in the progress of this kind of work." This kind of methodological self-correction is not incidental. It is what distinguishes a serious empirical practice from an uncritical enthusiasm. Sabina revised her understanding of specific visions over decades of practice. Fernandez documented how Bwiti practitioners themselves distinguish more from less experienced initiates by the depth of their integration and the accuracy of their subsequent interpretations. Fletcher, in his manuscript, does the same work, documenting the record faithfully, including the failures, and revising his interpretations as continued practice makes revision appropriate. This is the epistemology of a real empirical tradition. What this case establishes, I began this chapter by naming the falsifiable prediction the framework of this book depends on, that a modern practitioner working with no knowledge of the historical traditions ought to converge on the same design principles the historical traditions arrived at. Fletcher's manuscript is one test of that prediction, and the test passes. Every element of the historical framework, small group size, intimate connection, prepared physical space, dietary preparation, engineered sonic intervention, chanted vocal work at specific pitches, mudra and breath integration, sacred geometry, mirror work, community of witnesses, trained interpretive framework, structured integration afterward, appears in Fletcher's protocol, arrived at through iterative empirical adjustment on his own experience. The specific interpretive framing he developed differs from the historical framings, as would be expected given the difference in cultural context. But the underlying design principles are the same. This is what the framework predicts and what the framework requires. If Fletcher's protocol had diverged systematically from the historical traditions, the framework would be in serious trouble. If Fletcher's protocol had produced consistently worse outcomes than the historical traditions did, the framework would be in serious trouble. Neither is the case. Fletcher's protocol produces experiences that map recognizably onto what the historical traditions produced, and his own reports of transformation, dissolution of fear of death, sustained changes in personality and behavior, ongoing psychic and perceptual capacities that persist after ceremony ends, match the reports the historical traditions have generated for centuries. The convergent rediscovery is not a small point. It is the empirical foundation for the entire framework this book is building. 6 historical case studies on 4 continents, plus 1 modern independent rediscovery, produce a total of 7 data points that converge on the same design principles. This is what real cognitive science looks like when it is being discovered empirically, from different starting points, by practitioners who share nothing but the underlying human nervous system and the class of pharmacological interventions available to it. The principles are real. The historical traditions were not decorating around a pharmacological event. They were operating an integrated cognitive intervention system whose design principles any sufficiently attentive practitioner can rediscover. Registers. At the established register, Fletcher's protocol as documented in real time by the practitioner himself. The specific design elements, small group, prepared space, dietary preparation, sound frequencies, chanting, mudra, breathwork, journal integration, as consistent across multiple ceremonies over multiple years. The pharmacology of LSD and psilocybin, the correspondence of his protocol elements to the historical traditions documented in the previous chapters. His own methodological self-corrections as evidence of empirical rigor. At the contested register, the specific frequency claims 432 Hz solfeggio frequencies as producing specific effects beyond general sonic environmental modulation. The specific vowel and note correspondences from the Rosicrucian material. The specific pyramid geometry claims. The observer effect interpretation of quantum mechanics that Fletcher sometimes invokes to explain his experiences, redirected to placebo neurochemistry and expectancy effects in the framework of this book. The specific chakra correspondences claimed for particular experiences. At the story register, Fletcher's reports of telepathic contact with co-participants. His reports of face portal and full-body morphing perceptions. His reports of entity contact, the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 2, 28, including the specific returning presence he identifies across multiple ceremonies with different partners. His reports of visual aura perception, electric highway pattern perception, and rainbow body perception. His reports of past life visions and self-morphing during mirror work. His reports of interspecies communication with plants. His reports of the death and rebirth pattern during high-dose ceremonies. The accumulated body of phenomenological content that constitutes his subjective record of the practice. Fletcher's manuscript closes Part 2 of this book. The 7 case studies together establish that ritual technology for the deliberate transformation of consciousness is a real practical discipline, that it has been independently developed by cultures with no contact with one another, and that the discovery of these principles is accessible to any practitioner willing to explore them empirically. That its design principles are recoverable from the historical record and from contemporary rediscovery, and that its effects on participants are describable in the same phenomenological categories across 3,000 years and radically different institutional contexts. What remains is to work out, in Part 3, what the modern neuroscience can tell us about the specific mechanisms by which these design principles produce their effects, and then in Part 4, to synthesize the findings into a coherent framework that can inform contemporary practice. We turn now to that mechanistic work. Part 3, Mechanistic Decomposition 3.0, what this part is for. Part 1 of this book laid out the theoretical framework, the choir principle at ritual scale, the placebo decomposition, the 3 registers of claim. Part 2 applied that framework to 7 case studies, 6 historical and 1 contemporary. What emerged was a consistent picture of an integrated ritual technology whose design principles the traditions independently converged on. What Part 2 did not do, because it was doing something else, was ask, for each component of the ritual technology, what specific neural mechanism it recruits, and what the modern research literature can tell us about how that mechanism produces its effects. That is what Part 3 does. It takes the ritual technology apart, mechanism by mechanism. And for each mechanism, it lays out what current neuroscience has established, what remains open, and how the mechanism fits into the larger choir. I want to be explicit about why this matters and about what it does not accomplish. It matters because the framework of this book only holds if the design principles are grounded in real neural mechanisms rather than in cultural convention. If the traditions were doing arbitrary things that happened to be effective for their own reasons, the convergent rediscovery argument of Part 2, Section 2.7 would be weakened, because there would be no reason for independent practitioners to arrive at the same conclusions. If, on the other hand, each element of the ritual technology recruits a specific, measurable neural mechanism, then the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 229, the convergence is exactly what a well-designed cognitive intervention program would look like across cultures. The framework depends on the mechanisms being real. It does not accomplish and does not attempt to accomplish the reduction of the traditions to their mechanisms. When I say that Sanskrit mantra recitation modulates the autonomic nervous system, I am not saying that Sanskrit mantra recitation is nothing more than autonomic modulation. When I say that group synchrony during the Eleusinian procession elevated oxytocin, I am not saying that the Eleusinian procession was nothing more than an oxytocin elevation event. Mechanistic decomposition tells us what the ritual technology is doing at the level of neural function. It does not tell us what the ritual technology means. It does not tell us whether the entities the participants encountered exist independently of the participants' nervous systems. It does not tell us whether the immortality the Vedic priests reported experiencing corresponds to a metaphysical fact about the underlying nature of consciousness. These are separate questions, and this book, following the framework of Part 1, Section 1.5, does not attempt to answer them. What Part 3 does is establish that the ritual technology is real cognitive science, that its components can be characterized in modern research terms, that the characterizations are consistent with the tradition's own accounts of what they were doing, and that the whole apparatus fits together in a way that produces predictable and reproducible effects on participant consciousness. The chapter proceeds through 7 mechanisms in turn: the pharmacological substrate, sound and hemispheric shift, sensory deprivation and the default mode network, fasting and the metabolic substrate, group synchrony and endogenous neurochemistry, expectancy and the meaning response, and spatial disorientation and vestibular processing. It closes with a synthesis section that returns to the choir principle and shows how these 7 independent mechanisms combine to produce effects that exceed the arithmetic sum of the individual contributions. 3.1. The pharmacological substrate. The classical psychedelics, psilocybin, mescaline, LSD, DMT, share a common pharmacological signature. They are partial agonists at the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, and much of their subjective effect derives from that specific receptor activity. The 5-HT2A receptor is concentrated on cortical pyramidal neurons in the layer V region of the neocortex, particularly in association cortices that integrate sensory, memory, and self-referential processing. When these receptors are agonized, the affected neurons fire in patterns different from their ordinary baseline, and the downstream consequences propagate through the networks they participate in. The most consequential of these downstream effects, for the purposes of this book, is the reduction in coherence of what has come to be called the default mode network. The default mode network is a set of interconnected brain regions, including the medial prefrontal cortex, the posterior cingulate cortex, the precuneus, and portions of the parietal cortex that show increased activity during rest, self-referential processing, autobiographical memory, and mind-wandering. It is the brain's baseline mode of operation when it is not focused on an external task. Under classical psychedelic influence, the default mode network shows reduced coherence. The regions that normally activate together become decoupled, and the network as a whole shows less integration. This finding, developed principally by Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues at Imperial College London, has been replicated across multiple psychedelic compounds and multiple imaging modalities. It is one of the most robust findings in contemporary psychedelic neuroscience. The subjective correlate of default mode network reduction is what participants describe as ego dissolution, a specific alteration in the felt sense of self, in which the boundaries between the self and the surrounding world become permeable, and the ordinary continuity of personal identity becomes attenuated. This is exactly what the Vedic priests were describing when they said Amrita, deathless. It is exactly what the Eleusinian initiates were describing when they said the fear of death had dissolved. It is what the Bwiti initiates describe as the death of the old self. It is what Sabina and the modern Mazatec tradition describe when the Niños Santos speak through the practitioner. And it is what Fletcher describes as breaking the veil. Different names arrived at across radically different cultures for what the current neuroscience literature is characterizing at the level of specific network dynamics, the temporary reduction in coherence of the brain systems that maintain ordinary self-continuity. Carhart Harris has proposed a broader framework called the entropic brain hypothesis to characterize what psychedelics do at the network level. The proposal is that ordinary waking consciousness is a low-entropy state in the sense used in information theory. The brain's activity patterns are relatively constrained, predictable, and organized around a small number of stable configurations. The default mode network is one expression of this low-entropy state. It constrains the possible thoughts and self-perceptions the person can have. Under psychedelic influence, the brain's activity patterns become higher entropy, more diverse, more variable, less constrained by the ordinary attractor states. This is why psychedelic experience is characterized by novelty, by unexpected associations, by the appearance of previously unavailable perspectives on familiar material. It is not that the brain is doing more work. It is that the brain is doing less filtering, and previously suppressed patterns of activity become available. Iboga, as noted in the Bwiti chapter, has a distinct pharmacology. Its primary mechanism is not straightforward 5-HT2A agonism. It has activity at NMDA receptors, at kappa opioid receptors, at serotonergic and dopaminergic systems, and it produces sustained effects on neurotrophic factors, particularly glial-derived neurotrophic factor, that persist for weeks after a single dose. The subjective experience is correspondingly distinct from the classical psychedelics. Longer duration, more narrative content, more explicit ancestral and biographical imagery, and notably, a pronounced anti-craving effect that has made Iboga the most effective known interruption of opioid addiction. What Bwiti was doing with Iboga is not the same intervention as what Eleusis was doing with ergot alkaloids, but the ritual technology surrounding both is convergent. And this is a specific example of the framework's central claim. The design principles of the ritual container generalize across pharmacologically distinct interventions. The key point for what follows is that the pharmacological substrate is doing specific things at the level of neural function that can be characterized in current research terms. It is not a mystery, and it is not the whole story. It is one component among several that the ritual technology stacks. What the other components do, and how they combine with the pharmacology, is what the rest of this chapter examines. Sound and hemispheric shift. Sound is a component of every ritual tradition we have examined. The Chavin Pututus, the Vedic mantra, the Bwiti Mongongo, the Mazatec chants, the Eleusinian legomena, and Fletcher's chanted sacred vowel sounds all constitute engineered sonic interventions incorporated into the ritual sequence. The specific mechanisms by which sound modulates the psychedelic experience are increasingly well characterized in contemporary research. The first mechanism is auditory entrainment. When the brain is exposed to a sustained rhythmic acoustic stimulus in a specific frequency range, the cortical electrical activity tends to synchronize with the stimulus frequency, a phenomenon called neural entrainment or frequency-following response. This effect has been documented across a range of frequencies and produces measurable EEG signatures. The Chavin Pututus, at approximately 110 Hz, fall within a range that produces documented effects on hemispheric activation. As the 2008 study conducted at the University of California, Los Angeles demonstrated, sustained exposure to tones in this frequency range shifts the balance of measurable neural activity from left hemisphere dominance toward right hemisphere dominance. The right hemisphere is broadly associated with holistic, spatial, and emotional processing, and the shift produced by 110 Hz exposure produces subjective effects consistent with reduced verbal analytical processing and increased emotional and imagistic experience, exactly the direction the Chavin ritual would have needed to push participant cognition to produce the effects the iconographic suggests were being sought. The second mechanism is autonomic modulation. Slow, sustained chanting practices, whether Sanskrit mantra, Gregorian chant, Sufi dhikr, or Mazatec velada singing, entrain not only the brain, but also the cardiovascular and respiratory systems. Luciano Bernardi and colleagues published a landmark 2001 paper in the British Medical Journal demonstrating that rosary prayer in Latin and Sanskrit yoga mantra recitation both produce a specific slowing of breath rate to approximately 6 breaths per minute, and that this breath rate produces synchronization between respiratory, cardiovascular, and cerebrovascular rhythms, with measurable increases in heart rate variability and baroreflex sensitivity. This is a direct autonomic effect of sustained chanting practice, and it is present whether or not the participant is under psychedelic influence. In the ritual context, it acts as a sustained modulator of the participant's physiological state throughout the ceremony. The third mechanism is what might be called meaning entrainment. The specific words being chanted, the specific melodies being sung, the specific narrative or invocatory content being delivered. These all provide interpretive framing for what the participant is experiencing under psychedelic influence. This is the mechanism at work in Sabina's identity chant. The words shape the participant's interpretation of the experience in real time, at the exact moment when the psychedelic effect is opening the participant to receive the framing. Contemporary research on the effects of narrative content on subjective experience under psychedelics is limited but growing. What is well documented is that participants in psilocybin trials consistently report that the specific music selected for the session substantially influences the character and content of their experience. Music with lyrics that align with the participant's psychological process tends to produce more positive outcomes than either silence or arbitrarily selected music. The traditions were doing this systematically. The fourth mechanism is spatial acoustics. The physical properties of the ritual space determine how sound is distributed, reflected, and localized. The Chavin galleries were engineered to produce auditory localization confusion, as documented by Kolar's Stanford archaeoacoustics work. Sound produced in one gallery is reflected through the corridor system in ways that make it very difficult for a listener elsewhere in the labyrinth to determine the source direction. This is a specific perceptual intervention. It undermines the ordinary vestibular auditory integration by which the brain orients itself in space. Under mescaline, in the dark, with sound apparently coming from everywhere and nowhere, the participant's orientational scaffolding is being deliberately disrupted. Similar spatial acoustic effects, less extensively studied, are almost certainly present in the telesterion at Eleusis, where the tiered seating, the columned interior, and the presence of the anacteron at the center would have produced specific acoustic effects, and in the smaller intimate spaces of the Mazatec velada and the Bwiti ebanza. Fletcher's use of 432 Hz music and specific solfeggio frequencies falls at the contested register of specific frequency claims, but within the established register of the general principle that structured sonic environment modulates the psychedelic experience. Whether 432 Hz specifically produces measurable effects distinct from 440 Hz has not been rigorously demonstrated in the peer-reviewed literature. That sustained specific frequency acoustic exposure modulates cortical activity, autonomic function, and subjective experience under psychedelic influence, has been demonstrated. Fletcher was reaching for a real effect through a specific cultural framing whose specifics may or may not be supported by future research. 3.3 Sensory Deprivation and the Default Mode Network. Every one of the historical traditions we examined incorporates some form of sensory restriction into the ceremonial container. The Shavin galleries are dark. The telesterion is dark. The Bwiti Ebanza is dark. The Mazatec Velada is conducted in near-total darkness. The Vedic Agni Kayana includes periods of restricted sensory input during specific ritual phases. Fletcher's ceremonies take place in darkened rooms with limited visual input, except for candles or specific ritual objects. This is not aesthetic preference. It is a specific perceptual intervention. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 33. The neural correlate of visual sensory restriction under altered states of consciousness is now reasonably well characterized. When ambient visual input is reduced, the visual cortex does not simply become silent. It becomes active in a different mode, generating what are called Ganzfeld effects, the perception of patterns, colors, and imagery that arise from the cortical activity itself, rather than from external stimulus. These endogenously generated visual experiences are one of the sources of what psychedelic users describe as closed-eye visuals. In the ordinary sensory environment, this cortical activity is suppressed by the overriding input of the actual visual field. In darkness, the endogenous activity becomes available. Under psychedelic influence, this effect is dramatically amplified. The 5-HT2A receptor activation produced by classical psychedelics acts on the same cortical layers involved in visual processing, and the combination of pharmacological receptor activation with reduced external input produces the vivid geometric and figurative visionary experience that participants across every tradition have reported. What Sabina saw in the darkness, what the Vedic priests described in Rig Veda 10.1.19, what the Bwiti initiates encounter in the Abanza, what Fletcher describes as face portal morphing and the electric highway. All of these are functions of the specific interaction between pharmacological receptor activation and sensory deprivation-mediated cortical reactivation of visual processing. The default mode network reduction described in section 3.1 above is potentiated by sensory restriction. When the brain is not being asked to process ordinary sensory input, the reduced coherence of the DMN allows for more dramatic reorganization of the self-model. This is why sensory deprivation research on its own, flotation tanks, extended darkness meditation, isolation chambers, produces subjective effects that partially overlap with the psychedelic experience, even without pharmacological intervention. The traditions understood, empirically, that combining sensory restriction with pharmacology multiplied the effect of both. There is a specific effect worth naming here, because it recurs across the phenomenological reports we have examined. The perception of others as different beings, as animals, as ancestral figures, as sequences of identities. The Bwiti face morphing, the Aztec Nahuali perception, the Mazatec cellular level perception of others, Fletcher's face portal experiences. All of these are functions of the specific interaction between pharmacological receptor activation and sensory deprivation-mediated cortical reactivation of visual processing. All report the same class of visual phenomenon. Another person in the ritual space is perceived, during peak effect, as not fixed in ordinary identity, but as displaying a sequence of alternative identities. Contemporary research on the fusiform face area, the specialized cortical region responsible for face recognition, has documented that under psychedelic influence, face processing becomes destabilized in specific ways. The brain's ordinary rapid categorization of a familiar face becomes less rigid, and the categorization process itself becomes available to conscious perception as it happens. What the participant perceives, in this destabilized state, is not hallucination in the sense of seeing what is not there. It is the ordinary process of face categorization being made perceptible, which produces the subjective experience of watching one face morph into another, combined with the sensory restriction that allows endogenous visual content to reach consciousness. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 34. With the pharmacological receptor activation, the result is exactly what the traditions have reported for millennia. 3.4. Fasting and the metabolic substrate. The dietary preparation phase is present in every tradition we have examined. Eleusinian initiates fasted on the day before entering the telesterion. Bwiti initiates observed dietary restrictions for days or weeks before the ceremony. Aztec ceremony participants avoid specific foods and abstain from sex, red meat, spicy foods, and alcohol. Andean Huachumero traditions include fasts of 12 to 24 hours before San Pedro ceremonies. Fletcher's protocol includes minimal eating for hours before ceremony and specific hydration practices with vitamin C heavy lemonade. The traditions were not asking their participants to fast for symbolic reasons. They were asking them to fast because it worked. The metabolic mechanisms by which fasting modulates the psychedelic experience are several. First, extended fasting produces a shift in the brain's fuel supply from glucose toward ketone bodies. This shift, called ketosis, alters the substrate available for neurotransmitter synthesis and modifies the permeability characteristics of the blood-brain barrier. Ketones cross the blood-brain barrier freely, and some evidence suggests that they facilitate the passage of other molecules as well. Under ketosis, the same dose of a psychedelic compound may reach the brain in different quantities and produce different effects than it would in a fed state. Second, fasting affects the availability of neurotransmitter precursors. Serotonin synthesis depends on tryptophan availability, which is affected by circulating amino acid levels. Extended fasting reduces the competition among amino acids for transport across the blood-brain barrier and can transiently increase tryptophan availability, which affects serotonin synthesis and downstream serotonergic function. For a serotonergic psychedelic acting at the 5-HT2A receptor, the ambient state of the serotonergic system matters for the character of the experience. Third, fasting produces elevated cortisol and adrenergic tone, which shifts the participant into a state of heightened attention and vigilance. This state amplifies both the perceptual acuity available to the participant during the ceremony and the emotional salience of what the participant experiences. In modern clinical trials with psilocybin, participants are typically fasted for several hours before the session, and this is not accidental. The clinical protocols have converged empirically on the same fasting practice the traditions arrived at. Fourth, fasting affects the vagal tone and autonomic balance, shifting the participant toward parasympathetic dominance during rest and toward more responsive sympathetic activation during salient events. This produces the physiological substrate for the deep meditative states that the traditions incorporate into the ceremony's opening and closing phases. Fifth, fasting affects the microbiome and the gut-brain axis. Research on the interaction between gut microbiome composition and psychiatric function, particularly serotonergic function, has advanced substantially in the last decade. Fasting shifts the microbiome composition in specific ways that affect systemic inflammation, cortisol response, and central nervous system function. These effects operate over hours to days, exactly matching the preparation timelines the traditions specify. Sixth, and this is the mechanism Fletcher identified explicitly in his manuscript's discussion of undereating during the difficult ceremony. Extreme fasting can push participants into a physiologically unstable state that makes the psychedelic experience harder to navigate. The Chavin and Eleusinian and Bwiti traditions all include specific pre-ceremony feeding, as well as fasting. Participants are not sent into the ceremony in a state of extreme depletion, but in a state of controlled metabolic preparation. Fletcher's revision of his own practice, after the difficult ceremony documented in the manuscript, converges on the same recognition. Fasting is a tool, and it must be calibrated to the specific ceremony and the specific participant. 3.5. Group Synchrony and Endogenous Neurochemistry. The traditions we have examined are not solitary practices. The Eleusinian procession involved thousands of participants walking, chanting, and shouting together for hours. The Vedic ritual involves 17 priests coordinating specific actions across 12 days. The Bwiti initiation is witnessed and supported by the community. The Mazatec Velada includes family members and close acquaintances. Even Fletcher's small group protocol, with just 2 participants, is fundamentally an interpersonal practice rather than a solitary one. The interpersonal dimension is not decoration around the individual pharmacological event. It is a specific mechanism. The neurochemistry of group synchrony has been mapped in several converging research programs over the last 2 decades. Ivana Konvalenka and colleagues published in 2011 the definitive early demonstration in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. During a firewalking ritual in a Spanish village, the heart rate patterns of the firewalkers, their close relatives watching them, and unrelated spectators showed distinct signatures of interpersonal synchronization. The heart rates of related pairs synchronized closely. The heart rates of unrelated observers did not, and the ritual event itself produced measurable coupling of physiological state between individuals who were connected through the ritual container. Subsequent research has extended this finding to a range of coordinated group activities: singing together, marching together, dancing together, praying together. Each of these produces measurable interpersonal physiological synchronization that persists after the coordinated activity ends. The endogenous neurochemistry recruited by group synchrony includes several specific molecular systems. Oxytocin, the mammalian neuropeptide most closely associated with social bonding and pair formation, is released during coordinated group activity in ways that increase interpersonal trust and reduce perceived social threat. Endogenous opioids are released during synchronous movement and are one component of what runners describe as runner's high. These same opioids modulate pain perception and are implicated in the analgesic effects of group ritual, which has been documented across a range of traditions. Vasopressin, related to oxytocin, is involved in the specific pair bonding and defensive responses that coordinated group activity produces. The Eleusinian procession, from Athens to Eleusis, was, from this perspective, a substantial physiological intervention. Several thousand people, walking together for hours, chanting Iakche in coordinated rhythm, swinging bok choy branches together, engaged in ritualized humor together, all of this would have produced a specific neurochemical state in every participant, characterized by elevated oxytocin, elevated endogenous opioids, reduced sense of individual isolation, and elevated felt connection to the collective. Arriving at Eleusis, after a day of this, the participants were not the same nervous systems that had left Athens. They were physiologically primed to receive the ceremony that followed. The small group intimacy of the Mazatec Velada, the Bwiti initiation, and Fletcher's protocol operates on the same mechanism at reduced scale. The neurochemistry produced by a small group of participants who love and trust each other, engaged together in a coordinated ritual practice, is a distinct physiological state that would not be produced by the same individuals conducting the same practice in isolation. This is why Fletcher's protocol emphasizes that the co-participants must be people the practitioner deeply loves and trusts. The interpersonal neurochemistry is doing specific work that only obtains when the relationship is real. There is a specific implication of this for the phenomenological reports the participants describe. The telepathic contact Fletcher describes with his co-participants, the intersubjective attunement Fernandez documented in Bwiti, the felt continuity between the Nganga and the initiate, all of these have a specific neurochemical substrate in the elevated oxytocin, vasopressin, and endogenous opioid states that coordinated group ritual produces. This does not tell us whether the felt telepathy corresponds to a real information transfer between the participants at some level that ordinary neuroscience does not yet characterize. That is a separate question. It does tell us that the felt telepathy has a specific physiological substrate that is available to modern research, and that the substrate is what the ritual technology has been specifically designed to produce. 3.6. Expectancy and the meaning response. We now return to the mechanism that Part 1 identified as the analytical spine of the whole framework, the meaning response, as characterized by Mormon and decomposed by Kapchuk. The relevance of this mechanism to the ritual technology is now more visible than it was when I first introduced it in Part 1, because we'd have seen how the historical traditions and the modern coda both build their protocols to maximize meaning response effects. The meaning response is a physiological consequence of the participant's interpretation of the treatment context. It is not a psychological consequence in the older dismissive sense of just in the mind. It is a specific set of measurable neurochemical events, including dopamine release in the striatum triggered by expected reward, endogenous opioid release triggered by expected analgesia, immune modulation triggered by the specific interpretive frame around illness, and cortisol modulation triggered by the perceived safety or threat of the treatment context. These effects have been demonstrated in controlled clinical trials across a range of conditions, and their magnitude is not small. In some clinical domains, the meaning response accounts for the majority of the therapeutic effect observed in active treatment arms of randomized trials. The Kapchuk decomposition from the 2008 BMJ trial identifies three separable components of the meaning response: assessment and observation, the therapeutic ritual, and the supportive relationship. Each contributes independently. Each can be scaled up or down independently. The traditions we have examined have scaled all three components to a degree that no modern clinical trial has yet matched. The assessment and observation phase in modern clinical practice is a 15-minute intake conversation. In the Eleusinian tradition, it is 6 months of preparation, from the lesser mysteries through the intensive 9-day sequence. In the Bwiti tradition, it is days or weeks of preparation with the nganga before the ceremony. In the Andean Huachumero tradition, it is the pilgrimage of up to 500 kilometers to reach the ceremony site. The extended duration of these preparation phases means that the participant enters the ceremony in a state of maximum expectancy, having spent extended time focused on what is coming, and having oriented substantial portions of their life toward the expected event. The dopamine release triggered by expected reward and the general priming of the neurochemical systems involved in the meaning response are consequently many times more intense than what a modern clinical trial produces. The therapeutic ritual itself, in modern clinical practice, is often minimally elaborated. In the traditions, it is maximally elaborated: architectural design, sensory choreography, coordinated music, symbolic action, staged reveals. Each element of this elaboration contributes to the specific and richly determined character of the ritual event, and each contributes independently to the meaning response. The more elaborated the therapeutic ritual, the greater the physiological effect it produces. The supportive relationship in modern clinical practice is provided by a therapist who has typically met the patient for the first time at the beginning of the treatment. In the traditions, it is provided by trained practitioners who have spent years or decades developing their expertise within a specific lineage, and who have often known the participant across substantial portions of the participant's life. The trust, the transferred authority, the felt confidence in the practitioner's competence are all substantially greater in the traditional context than in the clinical one. What this means mechanistically is that the meaning response effects being recruited by the traditions are of a magnitude that modern clinical research has substantially underestimated. When Kapchuk's team measures the effect of a warm clinical encounter on IBS symptoms, they are measuring a small fraction of what the meaning response is capable of producing. The traditions over the millennia in which they were being developed converged on protocol elements that maximize each component of the response. This is the specific mechanism by which the ritual technology amplifies the pharmacological event. The meaning response neurochemistry combines with the psychedelic neurochemistry, and the combined effect substantially exceeds what either produces alone. 3.7. Spatial disorientation and vestibular processing. The Chavin labyrinth is a specific instance of a more general mechanism that appears across the ritual traditions in various forms: the deliberate disruption of the participants' ordinary spatial orientation. 2 kilometers of interconnected corridors on multiple levels, with right-angle turns and shifting depths, is a machine for spatial disorientation. The pilgrim in the Chavin galleries loses track of direction, depth, and location within the labyrinth. This disorientation is not incidental. It is a specific perceptual intervention that recruits a specific neural mechanism. The mechanism is the vestibular system and its integration with visual and proprioceptive input to construct the brain's ongoing model of the self's location and orientation in space. Ordinary self-awareness includes a continuously updated 3-dimensional model of where you are, which way you are facing, and how your body is positioned relative to the surrounding environment. This model is constructed by the temporoparietal junction and related cortical regions, drawing on vestibular signals from the inner ear, visual input, and proprioceptive feedback from the body. When the ordinary integration of these inputs is disrupted, whether through spinning, through prolonged darkness and unfamiliar geometry, through psychedelic influence, or through direct electrical stimulation of the temporoparietal junction, the self-location model destabilizes. The felt sense of embodiment can shift. Participants under these conditions frequently report out-of-body experiences, perceived expansion or contraction of body size, floating sensations, and other alterations of the ordinary sense of physical selfhood. Olaf Blanqui and colleagues at the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne have demonstrated that direct electrical stimulation of the temporoparietal junction can produce out-of-body experiences on demand without any pharmacological intervention. These findings characterize the specific neural mechanism by which spatial disorientation produces the alterations of self-model that the traditions have been engineering for millennia. At Chavin, the participant is under the influence of mescaline from San Pedro and Vilca alkaloids from Anadenanthera, moving through the labyrinth in near darkness with disorienting sound coming from unlocatable directions, with vestibular input being continuously perturbed by the right-angle turns and shifting corridor geometries. The self-location model is being systematically destabilized by every accessible sensory channel simultaneously. This is why the reveal at the Lanzone would have produced the specific effect it did. The participant's sense of self had already been unmoored by the labyrinth journey, and the sudden appearance of the Fang deity in the illuminated chamber came into a nervous system whose ordinary orientational scaffolding had been comprehensively disrupted. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 39. The Bwiti Abanza, with its central pole, its mirrors, and its specific ritual geometry, produces a related but distinct disruption of self-model. The mirrors are particularly important. Mirror-mediated self-perception under psychedelic influence produces the face-morphing and rainbow body phenomena that Fletcher and the Bwiti tradition both report, because the destabilized self-model is being visually confronted with the participant's own image in a state where ordinary categorization is impaired. The Mazatec Velada, conducted in a small space in near darkness, produces a subtler version of the same mechanism through the confinement and the temporal disorientation of the long night. Fletcher's mirror work is a specific and independently rediscovered application of this mechanism. He reports that the mirror-mediated self-perception during peak ceremony produces the sequential identity perception, the rainbow body appearance, and the felt sense of being confronted with his own multi-life identity. What is happening at the neural level is the intersection of psychedelic-induced 5-HT2A activation, sensory restriction-mediated cortical reactivation of visual processing, and mirror-mediated destabilization of self-location. Each of these is a documented mechanism in its own right. Combined, they produce the specific phenomenon Fletcher reports. 8. The choir at full volume. We can now see, mechanistically, what the choir principle at ritual scale actually consists of. It is not a metaphor. It is a specific claim about how independent neural mechanisms combine to produce an emergent state that exceeds the arithmetic sum of the individual contributions. The pharmacological substrate is doing one thing, agonizing 5-HT2A receptors, or in the case of Iboga, recruiting a complex atypical pharmacology, producing reduced coherence of the default mode network and generating the high-entropy brain state that makes previously unavailable patterns of activity accessible to consciousness. The sound intervention is doing a second thing, entraining cortical rhythms through frequency following, modulating autonomic function through slow chanting, providing interpretive framing through specific vocal content, and disrupting spatial orientation through engineered acoustics. The sensory restriction is doing a third thing, allowing endogenous cortical activity to become perceptible, potentiating the visual effects of the pharmacology, and freeing the default mode network from its ordinary anchoring and external input. The fasting is doing a fourth thing, shifting metabolic substrate, modulating neurotransmitter availability, elevating attentional tone, and preparing the vagal and autonomic systems for the ceremony. The group Synchrony is doing a fifth thing, elevating oxytocin, endogenous opioids, and vasopressin, producing measurable interpersonal physiological coupling, reducing the sense of individual isolation, and increasing felt safety within the ritual container. The expectancy structure is doing a sixth thing, recruiting the specific meaning-response neurochemistry documented in the placebo literature, at scale substantially exceeding what modern clinical settings produce. The spatial disorientation is doing a seventh thing, destabilizing the temporoparietal junction's ordinary construction of the self-location model, opening the participant to the specific alterations of embodiment that the traditions incorporate into their ritual sequences. Each of these 7 mechanisms has been demonstrated in modern research to produce measurable effects on cognition and consciousness. Each has been characterized at the level of specific neural mechanisms in specific brain regions. Each is doing independent causal work, and each, in the ritual context, is being recruited simultaneously with the others. The combined effect is not the sum of the individual effects, it is qualitatively distinct. When you take a psychedelic in a well-lit kitchen with no ritual preparation, the pharmacology does what the pharmacology does. When you take the same dose in the middle of a Chavin-style ritual with all 7 mechanisms operating at peak intensity, the effect on consciousness is what the traditions have been reporting for 3,000 years. Dissolution of ordinary self, encounter with what the tradition frames as divine presence, experience of the transformative content the tradition understands the ceremony to produce. The choir is not an amplifier. The choir is a fundamentally different intervention. This is what the framework of this book has been building toward. The ritual technology of the historical traditions is not decoration around a pharmacological event. It is a specifically engineered cognitive intervention in which 7 or more independent neural mechanisms are being recruited simultaneously to produce an emergent state that none of them produces alone. The traditions arrived at this design through millennia of iteration. Modern practitioners can and do rediscover the same design principles through careful attention to what works. The specific mechanisms are now characterizable in modern research terms. What remains is to synthesize the findings into a coherent framework that can inform contemporary practice, and to identify what the appropriate ethical and cultural frames for such application should be. We turn now to that synthesis in Part 4. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 41, Synthesis 4.0, What this book has argued. The argument of this book, laid out over the preceding 3 parts, comes to this. There exists a coherent body of ritual technology developed independently by cultures on multiple continents over the last several thousand years, whose purpose is the reliable transformation of human consciousness. This technology is not decoration around a pharmacological event. It is an integrated cognitive intervention system in which the pharmacology is one component among several, and in which the surrounding components, architectural, acoustic, dietary, choreographic, interpersonal, interpretive, are engineered with a level of sophistication that modern research is only now beginning to characterize. The traditions that developed this technology understood in their own vocabularies what they were doing. They encoded the design principles in stone, in ritual sequence, in lineage-transmitted practice, in text where text was available. Most of these traditions were suppressed or reduced by later religious and political institutions, and much specific knowledge has been lost. What remains is enough to reconstruct the general design, and the general design turns out to be strikingly consistent across cultures that had no contact with one another. The consistency is not coincidence. It is what convergent discovery looks like when independent groups of intelligent, careful, iterating practitioners work on the same underlying reality. In this case, the human nervous system and its response to specific pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions. What the priests at Chavin were doing 3,000 years ago, what the Hierophants at Eleusis were doing in the classical period, what the Hotur and Advaru chanting the Rigveda were doing at approximately the same time. What the Mazatec curanderas continued through 400 years of colonial suppression, what the Bwiti Nanga continue in Gabon today, what the Aztec priesthood formalized at the coronation of Moctezuma II in 1502, and what a modern practitioner in Los Angeles converged on through several years of careful iteration between 2018 and 2023, are all recognizable as expressions of the same underlying design. The design has real components. Each component recruits a specific neural mechanism. The combined effect exceeds the sum of the individual contributions. This is the choir principle at ritual scale, and it is the central claim of this book. Part 4 synthesizes what has been argued and points to what remains. It begins with the epistemological claim about what the traditions actually knew, because this is the claim that most needs to be made clearly and defended explicitly. It proceeds to the general design principles that emerge from the case studies and the mechanistic decomposition. It addresses the ethical questions about contemporary application, because those questions are urgent and cannot be deferred. It identifies the broader implication of the framework for non-psychedelic practice, which is the connection to what a companion volume will develop in more detail. It assesses where modern psychedelic research currently stands relative to what the framework suggests it needs to do. And it closes by the Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script, Part 2, 42, naming what this book does and does not accomplish, and what remains open for future work. 4.1. What the traditions actually knew. The most important claim of this book, and the one that most requires defense against the reflexive skepticism of contemporary Western intellectual culture, is that the ancient ritual traditions of consciousness were operating a real applied science. They were not doing superstition dressed up in ceremony. They were not, in the older anthropological framing, performing primitive religious response to conditions they could not otherwise explain. They were doing systematic empirical work on a specific problem: how to reliably produce specific transformative states in the participants who came to them, and how to structure the surrounding institution so that the transformative effects would be interpretable, integrable, and beneficial, rather than destructive. The evidence for this claim, assembled across parts 1 through 3 of the book, is now on the table. The Chavin architects engineered acoustic effects whose specific neurophysiological consequences a modern research group at UCLA has documented. The Eleusinian priestesses developed a preparation of ergot alkaloids, whose chemistry a modern research group at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens has demonstrated is achievable using only materials available in classical antiquity. The Vedic altar builders solved geometric problems encoded in the Shulba Sutras, whose sophistication predates and in some cases anticipates the Greek mathematical tradition. The Mazatec curanderas developed a body of empirical dose management and interpretive integration that modern clinical research on psilocybin is now, in its own vocabulary, rediscovering. The Bwiti practitioners developed a specific ritual application of Iboga, whose anti-addictive properties have become one of the most significant contemporary discoveries in psychopharmacology, and which the Bwiti themselves had been using for the same purpose for generations before Howard Lotsof brought the discovery to Western attention. The Aztec priesthood integrated the mushroom ceremony into state ritual at the highest level, with specific dose specifications, specific ceremonial contexts, and specific interpretive frameworks that Sahagun's Nahua informants preserved in detail sufficient to establish continuity with what Sabina was still practicing 450 years later. Each of these accomplishments would be recognized as scientific work if it had been done by a modern research institution and published in a peer-reviewed journal. What separates the traditional work from modern research is not the quality of the work, but the institutional context in which it was done and the vocabulary in which it was transmitted. The traditional practitioners did not have access to the specific analytical concepts of contemporary neuroscience. They did not have MRI machines to characterize what psilocybin does to the default mode network. They did not have HPLC to identify which alkaloid fractions were active in ergot preparations. They did not have peer-reviewed journals to publish their findings. What they had was several thousand years of iterative empirical practice, transmitted through lineage, encoded in ritual sequence, and refined through generations of practitioners who could tell what worked and what did not. This is what applied science looks like when it is being done by pre-industrial cultures, and it deserves to be recognized as such. The reflexive Western dismissal of traditional knowledge as pre-scientific, as superstition, as folk practice. This dismissal is itself a specific cultural bias with specific historical origins in the colonial and missionary encounters between European institutions and non-European traditions. The bias has cost us substantially. The suppression of the mushroom ceremonies in 16th century Mexico, the extirpation of the Andean Huachumero lineages during the colonial period, the abandonment of research on ibogaine in the 1970s when it was scheduled as a controlled substance despite its documented anti-addictive properties, the general Western intellectual reluctance to engage seriously with the phenomenological content of traditional ritual reports until the last 2 or 3 decades. All of this represents a substantial loss of knowledge that we are now, slowly, beginning to recover. The framework of this book is a specific attempt to accelerate that recovery by making explicit what the traditions were doing. Not by asserting the metaphysical claims the traditions made about the entities their participants encountered. Not by taking positions on questions that current research cannot answer. But by identifying the specific ritual technology, decomposing it into its component mechanisms, and demonstrating that the technology is real, is coherent, is generalizable, and is worth taking seriously as a body of knowledge that has substantial contemporary application. 4.2. The General Design Principles. The 7 case studies of Part 2, examined through the mechanistic decomposition of Part 3, converge on a set of general design principles that I now want to lay out in synthetic form. These principles are not novel in themselves. Each has been present in every case study, and I have named them repeatedly across the book. What follows is the assembly in one place of what the framework says a properly designed ritual container includes. First, extended preparation. The interval between the participant's decision to enter the ritual and the actual pharmacological event should be substantial. Not hours, but days, weeks, or months. The traditions varied in how they structured this preparation, but they were unanimous that a properly prepared participant produces a substantially different ritual outcome than an unprepared one. The mechanism as Part 3 developed is the accumulated meaning response neurochemistry that extended preparation recruits. Expectancy effects, dopamine priming, and the orientation of the participant's attention toward the coming event. Second, dietary preparation. Specific dietary restrictions in the days before the ritual, and fasting or minimal eating in the hours immediately preceding, modulate the pharmacological effect of the psychoactive compound through the metabolic mechanisms Part 3 described. Traditions varied in their specific dietary prescriptions, but the general principle of controlled metabolic preparation was universal. Third, prepared physical environment. The ritual takes place in a space that has been specifically prepared for the purpose, and that is distinct from the participant's ordinary living or working space. The preparation may be architectural, in the sense of a purpose-built temple or sanctuary. It may be arrangemental, in the sense of a familiar space that has been cleaned, consecrated, and equipped with the specific ritual objects the tradition uses. What matters is that the space is understood by all participants as ritual space rather than ordinary space. The ritual environment includes specific interventions on the participants' sensory processing, darkness or specifically modulated lighting, sustained or structured sound, controlled scent, controlled temperature. These interventions recruit the specific neural mechanisms Part 3 developed: the endogenous cortical activity revealed by sensory restriction, the entrainment and autonomic modulation produced by sustained specific frequency sound, and the interpretive framing provided by specific vocal content. Fifth, coordinated movement and breath. The ritual includes specific choreography, dance, procession, hand gestures, breathing patterns that the participants perform together or in specific coordination with the ritual leader. This recruits the group synchrony neurochemistry and the vagal autonomic effects that Part 3 developed. The Bwiti Mangango accompanies specific movements. The Sanskrit mantra recitation includes specific breath patterns. The Eleusinian procession involved coordinated walking, chanting, and branch swinging. Fletcher's protocol includes qigong practice and specific mudra positions. The common element is coordinated somatic activity that modulates the participant's physiological state. Sixth, a trained interpretive relationship. The ritual is conducted by, or in the presence of, a practitioner who has developed expertise within a specific tradition and who is capable of providing real-time framing and post-event integration. This is Kopchak's supportive relationship component, scaled up substantially from a modern clinical encounter. The Anganga, the Hierophant, the Chota Chine, the Huachumero, the Hotra, each is a trained interpretive presence whose expertise is essential to the ritual's success. Seventh, community of witnesses. The ritual takes place in the presence of others who share the interpretive framework and who witness the participant's transformation. The scale varies from the intimate small group of the Mazatec Velada or Fletcher's protocol to the thousands of witnesses at the Eleusinian ceremony. What matters is that the participant is not alone, and that the surrounding people share the tradition's understanding of what is happening. This recruits the group synchrony mechanisms and provides the social validation that the meaning response literature has documented as essential to sustained transformation. Eighth, pharmacological climax. The psychoactive substance is administered at a specific point in the ritual sequence, in a specific dose calibrated to the participant, in a specific preparation that maximizes bioavailability of the active compounds. The traditions varied in their specific pharmacology: mescaline and DMT at Chavin, LSA at Eleusis and among the Aztec, from ergot and ololiuki respectively. Whatever the original soma was in the Vedic tradition, psilocybin among the Mazatec and Aztec, ibogaine and Bwiti, but they were unanimous that dose and timing matter substantially. The pharmacology is the substrate on which the other mechanisms act. Without it, the ritual container is diminished. With it, the container produces effects that neither the pharmacology nor the ritual alone can produce. Ninth, structured integration. After the pharmacological event has resolved, the participant engages in specific practices that fold the experience into ongoing life. Discussion with the ritual leader, sharing of visions with the community, interpretation of specific content received during the ceremony, behavioral changes prescribed on the basis of what was revealed. Journaling, in Fletcher's contemporary version. The integration phase is not incidental to the ritual. It is what makes the transformation durable. Without integration, the experience is a one-time event that fades. With integration, the experience becomes part of the participant's continuing psychological structure. These 9 principles are the general design that the case studies converge on. Different traditions emphasize different components, adapted them to different cosmologies, and elaborated some more fully than others. But every case study of Part 2 includes recognizable versions of most or all of these principles. And the modern coda demonstrates that a contemporary practitioner working from scratch arrives at the same set. This is what the framework predicts and what the framework claims. The design principles are real, they are discoverable, and they can be assembled deliberately by anyone who understands what they are for. 4.3 The ethical questions about contemporary application. I now come to the question that has been implicit throughout the book and that cannot be deferred any longer. If the design principles are real and generalizable, then they can be applied deliberately. And the question becomes, who applies them? Under what conditions? With what obligations to the communities from whom the knowledge originally came? This question is not academic. The current moment in Western engagement with psychedelic ritual technology is one of substantial and rapid expansion. Ayahuasca retreat centers operate across the Americas and increasingly in Europe. Iboga treatment centers, mostly outside the United States due to regulatory restrictions, treat opioid addiction with methods derived from Bwiti practice. Psilocybin-assisted therapy is being decriminalized in a growing number of jurisdictions and is under active FDA review in the United States for the treatment of depression and end-of-life anxiety. San Pedro ceremonies are widely available across the American West. Ceremony facilitators of every variety of training and non-training operate in this expanding market. Some of them are practitioners of long lineage, transmitting knowledge they were properly trained in. Many of them are not. The ethical question this raises has several distinct components. The first is the question of extraction. The knowledge that makes contemporary psychedelic practice possible was the engineered ecstasy, preserved and transmitted at substantial cost by specific communities. The Mazatec Sierra preserved the mushroom ceremony through 4 centuries of colonial suppression, and paid a specific price when Wasson's 1957 publication exposed the tradition to mass Western tourism. The Bwiti tradition has been similarly exposed through the Iboga treatment industry. The Andean Huachumero lineages continue to operate with substantially less support and recognition than the Western practitioners who have learned from them. What is owed to these communities is a real question, and it has real answers that go beyond acknowledgement. Financial support, political advocacy, respect for the community's own sense of who is authorized to transmit their knowledge, and the willingness to say no to specific requests that the communities themselves have not endorsed. All of these are components of a serious ethical engagement. The second component is the question of context. The framework of this book has argued at length that the ritual container is not incidental to the pharmacological event. It is the majority of the intervention. This has implications for the current clinical trials, which are attempting to isolate the pharmacological effect while systematically stripping out the ritual container in the name of experimental rigor. If the framework of this book is correct, this approach is systematically underestimating what a properly designed intervention can accomplish and is producing effect sizes that substantially underrepresent what the traditional practitioners were achieving. The question is whether the modern clinical infrastructure will eventually incorporate the ritual technology that the traditions understood, or whether it will continue to focus on pharmacology as the primary or exclusive intervention. The current direction is mixed. Some psychedelic-assisted therapy protocols include serious attention to setting, music, therapeutic relationship, and integration. Others treat these elements as regulatory constraints to be minimized. The framework this book has argued for suggests that those taking the ritual container seriously will produce better outcomes and will look more like what the traditions were doing. The third component is the question of who can practice. Not everyone who wants to lead psychedelic ceremony is capable of doing so responsibly. The traditions had extensive training requirements, extensive apprenticeships, and specific criteria by which the community identified who was qualified. The Bwiti Nanga was not self-appointed. The Mazatec Chiota Chione was not self-appointed. The Eleusinian Hierophant came from specific priestly families with generations of transmitted expertise. Contemporary Western practice does not have equivalent training infrastructure. It is emerging in some contexts. The training programs at MAPS, at CIIS, at various other institutions attempting to build serious training curricula. But it is uneven, contested, and often driven more by commercial than by traditional considerations. The question of who is qualified to lead ceremony and how that qualification is established is one of the most important open questions in the current psychedelic renaissance. The fourth component is the question of what happens to the traditions themselves. When a tradition's ritual technology is stripped from its cultural context and applied in Western clinical settings, or in commercial retreat centers, or in individual private practice, what happens to the tradition? The Mazatec answer to this question has largely been that the tradition is harmed by the extraction. The Bwiti answer is more mixed, with some Gabonese practitioners actively welcoming Western participation and others rejecting it. The Andean Huachumero lineages have largely maintained their own practice, while some Western practitioners have developed derivative traditions. What is clear is that the tradition-community relationship is not incidental to the ritual technology. The technology was developed within a specific cultural matrix, and its removal from that matrix has consequences for both the receiving community and the source community. I do not have a comprehensive answer to these questions. What I can say is that the framework of this book, if it is taken seriously, has substantial ethical implications that anyone applying the framework in contemporary practice needs to work with rather than ignore. The traditions are not free resources for Western extraction. The ritual technology is not separable from the ethical obligations that its transmission entails. And the current moment of expanding psychedelic practice will be judged in retrospect substantially by how well the ethical questions were engaged. 4.4. The broader implication, ritual technology beyond psychedelics. There is a specific implication of the framework this book has argued that I have hinted at throughout Part 2, and that deserves explicit statement here. If the ritual technology is a general set of design principles that maximizes the effect of a psychoactive intervention on human consciousness, then it should apply to interventions beyond the classical psychedelic pharmacology. The design principles are not compound-specific. They are general principles about how the human nervous system responds to structured cognitive interventions. The Vedic Soma case study of Part 2, Section 2.3 provided the direct evidence for this claim. The Nambudiri Agnachayana, as currently practiced, uses a soma substitute of much reduced pharmacological potency compared to whatever the original Rigvedic soma was. Yet the ritual continues to produce meaningful effects on the participants. The choir with one voice missing still sings. This means that the design principles operate through mechanisms that are not exclusively dependent on the specific pharmacology. The ritual container, on its own, is doing substantial cognitive work. When you add pharmacology back in, the container amplifies the pharmacology. When you take the pharmacology out, the container still functions at reduced but non-zero effect. The implication of this is that the ritual technology has substantial application beyond the psychedelic context. Any pharmacological intervention that acts on the central nervous system, from caffeine to cannabis to prescribed antidepressants to the specific herbal preparations that make up the world's traditional pharmacopoeias, can in principle be amplified by application of the same design principles the traditions developed for the psychedelic ceremonies. And beyond pharmacology, entirely non-pharmacological interventions, meditation, prayer, structured therapy, ritual practice without any substance, recruit many of the same neural mechanisms that the psychedelic ceremonies do, at reduced intensity through the same choir principle. This is the connection point to the companion volume that will build out the everyday application of the framework. Where the current book has focused on the intense end of the ritual technology spectrum, the historical psychedelic traditions, and the transformative ceremonies they conducted, the companion volume develops the lower intensity application. How the design principles can be applied to ordinary daily practice, to non-psychedelic herbal traditions, to meditation and prayer, to the general project of using ritual technology to shape and support cognitive function over the long duration of ordinary life. The framework is the same, the intensity is lower, the application is broader, and the empirical results, in the traditions that have applied the framework at this lower intensity for centuries, Ayurvedic daily practice, Chinese medicine's cognitive herb traditions, various contemplative practices across many cultures, provide the evidence base for the companion volume's argument. The general point is that the choir principle, at ritual scale, is not exclusively about the transformative event. It is about how design principles combine to produce effects on human consciousness. The historical case studies of this book are the peak intensity applications of the framework. The everyday applications are the ones that most contemporary readers will actually be in a position to use in their own lives. And the framework applies to them with equal force, even though the specific components are less dramatic. 4.5. Where modern psychedelic research currently stands. I want to address, briefly, the current state of Western psychedelic research and what the framework of this book suggests it is doing well and where it is falling short. The current infrastructure of academic and clinical psychedelic research includes the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research, the Imperial College London Center for Psychedelic Research, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, the psychedelic research programs at Yale, NYU, UCSF, and a growing number of other institutions. This infrastructure has produced substantial and important research over the last 2 decades. The Griffiths Group's work on psilocybin and mystical experience, the Carhart-Harris Group's work on the default mode network and the entropic brain, the MAPS MDMA-assisted psychotherapy trials for PTSD, the psilocybin trials for treatment-resistant depression, the ongoing work on ibogaine and opioid addiction, and many others. This research has been essential to the current legitimization of psychedelics as therapeutic agents, and to the regulatory movement toward FDA approval of psychedelic-assisted therapies. What the framework of this book suggests, however, is that this research infrastructure has been systematically underestimating what the interventions it is studying can accomplish, because it has been isolating the pharmacology while stripping out most of the ritual container. The typical psychedelic clinical trial includes a modest attempt at set and setting, comfortable furniture, curated music, 1 or 2 therapists present, but very little of what the historical traditions understood as essential. There is no extended preparation phase measured in weeks or months. There is no coordinated group activity. There is no engineered spatial environment. There is no lineage-transmitted interpretive framework beyond what the specific therapist happens to bring. There is no community of witnesses beyond the clinical staff. There is no chanted vocal intervention. There is minimal integration beyond a few therapy sessions after the pharmacological event. The current research, in other words, is measuring what happens when the pharmacology is administered in a minimally elaborated ritual container. This is analogous to measuring the effect of a violin note played by a single violinist in an empty room, and drawing conclusions about what a full orchestra performing a symphony can accomplish. The effect sizes are real. They are substantially smaller than what the historical traditions were achieving, and they will continue to be smaller until the research infrastructure incorporates a more serious understanding of what the ritual technology consists of. This is not a criticism of the individual researchers. The current research infrastructure has been operating within specific regulatory, methodological, and institutional constraints that make elaborate ritual containers difficult to implement in randomized controlled trials. The very features that make ritual technology effective, the elaborate preparation, the community of witnesses, the lineage-transmitted framework, the integration into the participant's ongoing life, are features that are difficult to standardize, difficult to randomize, and difficult to fit into the experimental designs that the FDA requires for drug approval. The research is doing what it can within the constraints it operates under. What the framework suggests is that the constraints themselves need to be revisited. The traditional practitioners were doing something that the modern clinical infrastructure has not yet figured out how to replicate. Some of what they were doing may not be replicable in Western clinical settings. The 6-month preparation from the lesser mysteries, the pilgrimage of 500 kilometers, the extended lineage training of the Hierophant. But some of what they were doing is clearly replicable if the will and the resources are present. More elaborate preparation phases, more integration of group ritual elements, more attention to the trained interpretive relationship, more serious engagement with the phenomenological content of the sessions, rather than the treatment of that content as noise to be measured against the standard outcome scales. The next generation of psychedelic research, if it takes the framework of this book seriously, will look substantially different from the current generation. It will incorporate more of what the traditions understood, and it will, I predict, produce substantially larger effect sizes than the current clinical trials are producing. This is a testable prediction. The next decade or two of psychedelic research will determine whether it is correct. What this book does not answer. I have said, throughout the book, that the framework does not require answers to the metaphysical questions the traditions raise. I want to state this explicitly one more time before closing, because it matters for how the reader integrates what the book has argued. This book does not take a position on whether the entities the participants encountered during ceremony exist independently of the participants' nervous systems. When Sabina reported that the principal one spoke to her, when the Bwiti initiates reported meeting specific ancestors, when the Rigvedic priests reported being made Amrita, when Fletcher reported encountering the specific returning presence across multiple ceremonies with different partners, the book has preserved these reports in first-person specificity, treated them as phenomenological data, connected them to the neural mechanisms that produce them, and left the metaphysical question open. Whether the entities are real in the sense that they exist in some domain external to the participants' nervous systems, or real only in the sense that they are consistent phenomenological patterns generated by human brains under specific ritual conditions, or real in some third sense that current metaphysics has not yet articulated, this book does not attempt to say. The framework does not require an answer to this question. The design principles work, the mechanisms are real, the effects on participants are documented. Whether the entities are metaphysically what the traditions claim they are, is a question for other inquiries. The book does not take a position on whether the transformative effects the traditions produce correspond to spiritual or metaphysical facts about the underlying nature of reality. When Eleusinian initiates emerged with the fear of death dissolved, when Bwiti initiates emerged with the felt knowledge of having crossed into the world of the ancestors, when Vedic priests reported becoming immortal, when Fletcher reported the sustained expansion of psychic capacity that persisted after ceremony, the book has treated these reports as phenomenological data, has identified the specific ritual mechanisms that produce them, and has left open the question of whether the participants' interpretations of what they had encountered correspond to metaphysical realities. The framework says that the participants had the experiences they reported. The framework does not say what the experiences ultimately are. The book does not take a position on the specific claims of any particular tradition. It does not endorse or reject the Aztec cosmology, the Vedic pantheon, the Mazatec understanding of the mushroom persons, the Bwiti account of the ancestor realm, the Rosicrucian sacred vowel and note correspondences, or any of the other specific interpretive frameworks the case studies have documented. Each tradition arrived at its own cosmology through its own history, and each cosmology was integrated with the ritual practice in ways that shaped the participants' interpretation of what they were experiencing. The book has preserved the tradition's own accounts, has analyzed the mechanisms that produce the phenomenological content, and has left the question of which cosmology best characterizes the underlying reality to the traditions themselves and to the participants who work within them. The Engineered Ecstasy, Listening Script Part 2, 51. These are deliberate silences. They are not evasions. They are the specific place where a scholarly framework has to stop, and where the personal and traditional and metaphysical work has to begin. The book has done what a scholarly framework can do. What comes next, for any reader who wants to engage further with what the framework opens up, is a matter of individual practice, individual tradition, individual metaphysical commitment. The framework provides the tools. It does not provide the answers to questions that its own methodology cannot address. 4.7. Closing. The engineered ecstasy of the title is not decoration. It is what the traditions were doing. They were engineering, with the tools available to them across 3,000 years and 4 continents, a specific class of experience in human participants. And they were doing so with a level of sophistication that we are only now beginning to appreciate. What they were engineering was not simply intoxication, was not simply religious ceremony, was not simply symbolic expression of what participants might have felt in any case. It was a specific transformation, reliably produced, whose effects were documented in the tradition's own vocabularies, and whose mechanisms are now becoming visible in modern research. This book has argued that we should take the tradition seriously as scientific work, not as folk beliefs, not as primitive religion, not as decorative superstition around a pharmacological event that was the real cause of the experience. As scientific work, in the specific sense of applied research on a specific problem, transmitted through specific institutional structures, refined through specific iteration, and encoded in specific ritual technologies whose design principles are recoverable from the historical record. The traditions were doing what modern cognitive science is now, slowly, learning to do, and what they were doing, in some specific respects, was substantially more sophisticated than anything the modern clinical infrastructure has yet accomplished, because they had thousands of years of practice, and the modern institutions have had, at most, a few decades. The recovery of what they knew is now underway. The 2025 chemical confirmation of San Pedro and Vilca at Chavin. The 2026 experimental demonstration of the ergot to LSA conversion using ancient methods. The reactivation of Nambudiri Agnikayana performance in the 21st century. The continued vitality of the Mazatec, Bwiti, Huachumero, and other living traditions that survived colonial suppression. The gradual willingness of Western academic and clinical institutions to take these traditions seriously as sources of knowledge, rather than as anthropological curiosities. All of this is part of a recovery that is happening in real time, and that has decades of further work ahead of it. What this book has done is to gather what is currently known, apply a specific analytical framework to it, and demonstrate that a coherent picture emerges. The picture is that the historical ritual traditions of consciousness were operating cognitive science. The design principles they discovered are real, are generalizable, and are now available for careful application in contemporary contexts, provided that the application is done with proper respect for the source traditions, proper attention to the ethical questions the application raises, and proper humility about what remains open. The framework is not the last word on any of these matters. It is a working synthesis that names what can be named now and points to what needs further development. The Chavin priests knew what they were doing. The Hierophants at Eleusis knew what they were doing. The Vedic Hotra chanting the 9th mandala into the fire knew what they were doing. The Mazatec Sabia, sitting with her hands over the candle, knew what she was doing. The Bwiti Nanga, guiding the initiate through the death of the old self, knew what he was doing. The Aztec priesthood, administering the mushrooms at the coronation of Moctezuma II, knew what they were doing. The modern practitioner in Los Angeles, iterating through years of careful attention to what makes his ceremonies reliable, was rediscovering what they knew, in his own vocabulary, from the ground up. The framework of this book claims that these are not 7 isolated cultural facts. They are 7 expressions of the same underlying discovery, made independently across time and space, and now available to us in a form that a careful reader can assemble into a coherent picture of what the ritual technology consists of and how it can be applied. That is what has been argued. What remains is to do the work. Series outro. You have reached the end of part 2 of the Engineered Ecstasy and the end of this 2-part audiobook presentation. This recording is part of the Historical Documents Access Project, a continuing effort to make important historical documents and historical research accessible to English-speaking listeners. Thank you for listening. We hope you will continue with the next title in the series.